Welcome, everyone. Oh, welcome anyways. I don't care where you're from, welcome. Nice to meet you. Hope you enjoy the video. It's just a video of just me driving down the road. Unfortunately, with YouTube, can't play music, so enjoy. I am from the United States. Preferably, I was raised in Utah, but I'm a trucker. I bounce all over the United States. Wherever the load goes, I go. And I'm hauling sheets of steel. Sorry for the fact that there's not going to be any audio, like music. You can blame YouTube for that. Hello, Thomas. Good afternoon to you. I'm just sitting here driving, listening to creepy stories on YouTube. Like one of my favorites is like creepy pasta and YouTubers like that just sit there and tell different types of scary or creepy stories. I hate road construction like this. It's annoying. But nothing you can do about it. Well, I enjoy listening to stories. Like I said, there's YouTubers like Creepy Pasta and a bunch of other YouTubers that just tell, creepy or scary stories on YouTube. It's very entertaining to listen to. Some of them might actually scare you with the stories they're telling them. Some of them talk about stuff like, skinwalkers. And believe it or not, skinwalkers actually do exist. They are very, very nasty creatures. If you're in the area and you talk about them or think about them, they can fit you and potentially kill you. They are not anything to screw with. I'm going to have to look that up. Paranormal Files. I'm going to have to look it up. Now, the YouTubers on YouTube that try to do scary videos, like haunted buildings and stuff like this, the thing is, I don't know if any of it's true. I don't know if it's been faked or whatever, but I will say this, it's definitely entertaining to watch. Paranormal Files. I'm gonna have to seriously look that up. Really? Oh, the want me to look that up. Cancel this video. Want to basically listen to you not watching. Paranormal Files. That's not what I said. I didn't say anal files. Stupid voice texting. Paranormal Files. So, it's the one that says the Paranormal Files official channel. Is it that one? I said the YouTube channel doesn't say the Paranormal Files official channel. Is it that one? Files official channel. Is it that one? Okay, good. I'll definitely subscribe to them. Apparently I already am, but I just didn't know it. It says subscribed. Interesting. Like I said, I didn't know I was subscribed to that channel. Interesting. I'm going to take a listen. Hopefully they have one that's long enough. There's one that's about 3 hours. Let's see. If I can get out of this construction area, pull the truck over, what I can do is I can connect it to my truck stereo and blast that through the speakers and let you guys listen to that. But I got to get out of this construction zone first. The truck's stereo will not let me connect while driving. Be stuck in this construction zone for a minute, so bear with me. In fact, that actually might be a workaround. Instead of blasting music, I blast stuff like paranormal stories. People might get a kick out of that. Come on. Ah, box truck broke down. He's about to get towed. Hey, if it entertains you, who cares? Take a look at that. Going to Missouri. Wheeling, Missouri. I got about 32,000 pounds of flat sheet steel on my trailer. Jeez, come on. Get me out of this construction zone. If I can figure out how to pull the stereo out and clip whatever wire that has to do with the brakes, I'll clip it so I can connect it anytime I'm driving. But unfortunately, can't right now. Come on. Been through there a couple of times. Actually, let me take that back. Quite a few times. It's an interesting state. If you want a good state to visit, I wouldn't say live, but visit. Go visit Utah. I mean, I know basically everyone's talking about it's a Mormon state, this, that, and the other. Trust me. Go visit Utah. I think you'll like it. Now I can actually pull over and connect my stereo, so I can play through the speakers. Come on, slow down, old girl. Slow down. Zone speed limit. I can't afford to jolt the load around, so let's go. Go to headset. Let's go to Bluetooth connections. Bluetooth. Add phone. EEA 700. Connect. Yes. Pairing complete. Let's go. Come on. Trying to connect. This thing takes a second sometimes. Really? There we go, finally. It says it's connected. Bluetooth. Okay. Back to YouTube.
I would not be here if not for
I did not tell you to change. Yes, allow. Did not tell you to change channels. Jeez Louise.
In my opinion, this is like the most notorious place in this entire country. The ancient Ram
There we go.
Inn. It's in this pit where they found the skeletal remains of children.
I was in Arizona. Too damn hot during the summer. And I'm not joking about that one. You think Texas is hot, Florida's hot? Yeah, trust me. California, or basically Arizona, can get quite fucking hot. Yeah, I'm just trying to get back on the road without causing an accident.
This is how you speak.
Oh, you're from Texas, but you live in Pennsylvania. Yeah, I'm kind of similar to you, except basically, for the most part, I lived in Utah, and for a short period of time, for like 2 or 3 years, I moved to Tennessee, and just got tired of the crap in Tennessee and moved back to Utah. So I'm gonna have to mute it. I don't want no damn copyright strike.
One of the places on planet Earth, the ancient Ram Inn.
Damn it. Fucking music, knock it off. I can't afford to play music. That'll be a copyright strike. Switch to a different one that
witchcraft, demons, Satanism, right in the heart of where we're going now. Right behind me is one of the most haunted places in the whole of the UK. 12 people from this area were accused of witchcraft, and they ended up on the end of a rope. They were cut down and they were buried in this
really
parkway.
nice in Tennessee.
I believe that angry spirits
Chance to
still
go
haunt this
visit?
area today.
Definitely
One of the
think
strangest
so.
things about the story
Nice
is
state,
she's always
nice state to visit.
Right now,
I would
guys,
recommend going to live there.
we are
I
headed.
mean, depending on where you go in
Now,
Tennessee,
there's very weird places around where we are. One of
rent
them
can be
is
really cheap.
with the side where they're like men.
Potentially get a house for a reasonable price per month. Just rent. Oh crap! The wind's really kicking up. Damn it!
Something demonic summoned on
Motherfucker.
accident. Is there a demon here?
You see this?
The witches
see the truck on the-
just got so
see the
much
side of the road where the wind's kicking up. I had to slow it down.
Area to you.
As soon as you turn your lights off,
I don't
you'll
want to
find
get blown
out.
off the damn road. That's
On
a good
tonight's
speed right
episode of
here.
the Paranormal Files, we're at one of the most haunted places in all of the United Kingdom. This is a very notorious place linked to stories of witchcraft and the story of the Pendle Witches. Welcome to Pendle Hill.
Yeah, I guess it all depends on where you move in Texas.
This place is kind of like the
But
Superstition
obviously,
Mountains of
don't go
England.
moving
There have
to
been
Utah.
so many different types
I
of
mean,
paranormal
I swear,
phenomena
Utah's trying to
reported.
get
There have been
with
phantom
California.
dogs,
Not
spirits
joking.
of witches, UFOs, serial killers. There are so many horrific stories that haunt this forest area. We couldn't even fit them all into one video. Right now, we're actually in the heart of the Pendle Hill area, nearby the location where back in the 1600s, a witch reportedly met with the devil himself. We're going to be exploring so many different stories tonight and investigating this place. I've waited years to ghost hunt at Pendle Hill, so this is a really exciting
Jeez,
video.
man.
Thank you everybody so much
Yeah,
for tuning
man.
in tonight. I'm Colin Browen, and you're watching The Paranormal Files.
Hey you guys, Bradley from Haunted Nights over in the UK. We've come to speak about the Pendle Witches and find out so much about this
Is it
location.
beautiful?
Our first
Oh,
and
yeah.
foremost stop is Clitheroe Castle, one of the most haunted places in this whole
Very nice
entire
place to
county.
visit.
We had to look and we had to come to find out.
Especially if you
some
go
of
to
the ghosts
Moab.
that are allegedly supposed to haunt
It's a really nice
this
place to
very
visit.
As we first
Yeah, take you out there like four-wheelers, ATVs, all that kind of stuff. Go out there and have some fun. It's nice out in Moab. Hot, yeah, but it's really nice. Do all kinds of stuff out in Moab.
Stood a
It's
garrison
fun.
that was here, and when the
And you got
War of the
just
Roses started
Utah in
and
general, it's
the
just-
army itself was making
you
its
can
way
do all
over
kinds of
to
stuff in
Preston,
Utah.
it
It's
did
fun.
stop here. There wasn't much of a battle. There was a white flag that held high above the very keep,
Yeah,
and people
nice,
did surrender,
right.
and they were placed in a makeshift jail, which was actually just outside next door, and a few did try to escape, and unfortunately for them, they were caught down in the small town of Clitheroe. Their actual uniform themselves gave them away. They were all back up and they were executed, having their heads chopped right outside the very building where we are now. Now, years later, police themselves have been reported to have come up to this location only to have heard the sound of soldiers shouting, "God save the King," from this very area where we are now. One of the most haunted places. There's even sounds, noises, bangs, poltergeist activity that has been reported within inside the keep. Even a small boy has been seen
Yeah, I'm gonna have to
in this
set
very
cruise
corner
control to
over
certain
there.
speed. Nope, not
Many
68.
years ago, there's a story of disease hitting this very town of Clitheroe where
There you
many
go,
people
set it to
suffered
55,
and died.
maintain control of truck at
Unfortunately, this young
55.
boy was
Wind's
supposed to have
kicking
come
up.
over with consumption, losing his life, and ever since his energy has been seen here. Now, because we are here due to the
supposed
story
to
of
be,
Pendle Witches that happened a few miles
back
away
to
from where we
Utah a
are.
couple days
They're
before the
supposed to
second, but
spend
that ain't
their
gonna happen.
last couple of days
Buildings for the
traveling
company.
from the very village of Barley.
I told him I had to go
Lancaster.
go to my
Now, they
cousin's
spent
wedding,
a few
and
hours with
better
inside
make
the
it
very
before I'm
where we
failing
are
on
now.
it.
Now, one of the infamous
Now, where I'm at
stories
now
of Pendle, which is the infamous
is
which herself
That's-
is from
that's
Denmark,
from
an old
Illinois.
82-year-old monarch of a family
And I'm
that lived on the
293
slopes of
miles
Pendle Hill.
for my delivery in Missouri.
many times.
Yeah.
Sort of hooded,
Fat
black
chance of me making it back to
figure
Utah before the
in corner
second.
of the room. One of the most reported activity when her energy, her ghost
Jeez,
is seen
oh,
here
beach.
is a foul smell. Once reported as almost like a very rancid BO smell that comes and goes from this very room. A very weird.
Now, Stephanie, I don't know if you've ever driven a truck. What I'm doing right now, it's a pain in the ass. Dealing with high winds. These trucks will turn over easy.
Were brought into this area.
12.
I just wish the truck was a bit heavier.
You can't really see it, but when we go out those doors, you'll see it. This is the key.
Yeah.
But the castle grounds were much bigger. Where we're parked down there, you can't really
I
see
think
it.
I'll make it.
When
I
we
just
stand
gotta
up, you go out and
take it easy.
It looks like a big spiral. So it would have been quite a big sort of area.
All these other
So
trucks are
obviously
sitting there
here,
hauling
it's like
ass.
the actual keep itself.
They got more weight than me. I got roughly 31,000 pounds in the trailer. I wish I had roughly 40-something thousand.
Quite a big sort of
So I'd have a bit more weight. But when it comes to high winds, if it gets bad enough, you're forced off. You have to get off the road
time as well.
unless you want to flip your truck.
We've had big wooden stairs that would have taken you up from the side.
Well, I'm doing my best. Be careful.
The main staircase there that we've just walked up is it's made by the council, mate.
Like I said, I'm doing about 55 right now.
So if you fall on there, at least you can sue. But back then you couldn't. What Jesus?
What is it?
The key.
Yeah, 55, I can control the
The
truck.
main structure of a castle is the main part of it. They have them all over the UK. One of them is in Newcastle as well, Castle Kew.
This
It's
truck's
almost
actually
like a
governed
lighthouse
at,
structure that stands tall.
67.
Normally has four walls
I wish I could
or
go faster than
structures
that.
to it as well.
Still.
Main foundations and base of a castle. Really. Some people use them as main halls. All over the UK, Ireland, Wales, they have different sort of fortifications for walls and stuff like that as well. So they're all time.
That was good though.
Doesn't matter what time you can come in. You can even come
That's great. Better country. Yeah. Significantly better country.
Yeah, but your country's pretty good, man, so don't worry about it. You got some sick shit, man.
Sorry, FedEx.
I mean,
Nothing I can do about it. It's called wind.
You got some weird stuff as well, like bacon, basically.
Yeah, being pushed.
So, right now, guys, we are headed to Pendle Hill. This is like, you want to talk about infamous UK haunts? This is straight up the Superstition Mountains of England. The amount of cryptids, the amount of ghosts, demons, otherworldly energies that surround this place. I've read and researched Pendle Hill for years, and this has just been like one of my bucket list locations to do. So to be heading there right now is not only dope, but I have to admit, I'm very on edge because of how bad
There goes the trees.
be up here. I've heard some horror stories about that.
Back into the wind again.
Here we go, man.
Okay, we've stopped at this location due to the phenomenon of paranormal activity that's supposed to occur behind me. This is Pendle Hill. I thought it was a sheep, but I was just letting you have your own. I was like, I was just letting you experience it. During the lambing season in March, March, April, if you come up here, you can hear them screaming at night, so it scares the shit out of people. But you can walk down, yeah. So anyway, we've come here due to the phenomenon of paranormal activity that is encountered on Pendle Hill. Right behind me is one of the most haunted places in the whole of the UK. It's massively haunted by the stories connected with the Pendle Witches, but with not just that, there's World War II stories of pilots being seen. There's also a manner of ghostly apparitions, mythological creatures that are also seen in this location right behind me. This location where we are now is also close to what we would say is Britain's Area 51. There is also reports of aliens that have taken place right here, encounters I should say, of UFOs, outer worldly experiences that have taken place here as well. We're quite close to a place called Topperden, which is infamous for the stories of aliens and abductions and all manner of different stuff that has been reported. Now that is why we started here. But we are right going into the heart of the Pendle Witch story now. We're going to take you to some of the most haunted locations with the story where witchcraft was supposed to have murdered people. We're talking witchcraft demons, Satanism, right in the heart of where we're going now.
And you said this area doesn't scare you, but down there is a different story.
We're only on the outskirts of where the story took place. Every inch that you walk now, every footstep you take will be back in time to where the witches were and the story that surrounds their execution and their murder, and most importantly, the paranormal activity that encountered afterwards.
Anything else you want to say?
No, let's get cracking. Next bit's
Let's
very
get
spot.
cracking, baby.
Okay,
I just want to say, guys, this is insane. This is my first time driving, not only on the left side of the road, but with the steering wheel on the right. And these roads are like the tightest, smallest roads I have ever seen in my life. And it's like just, I don't even know if the footage is getting it across enough just how like tiny these roads are. But it's just eerie thinking of, I mean, there's nobody out here, you know? It's pitch black all around us. No one
back
here.
in the trees again.
And
We're
drive
die
away
off a
from it.
bit.
You can't even do that. Like, let's say a werewolf comes out and tries to kill us. Here we go again. This super, super tight, winding roads.
This is gonna be the shakiest shot ever.
Just come to stop at one of the locations along to the Pendle Trail, and we because it's very closely linked with a local legend. This is Jenny's well. It's just behind us now as well. There's a Victorian story, a very old story that talks about a young lady. She was in service in one of these houses that were around a manor house. She would look after the children after being a nanny, and unfortunately a few of the local children passed away unnecessarily. They couldn't understand why. They didn't realise what happened. Was it disease? Was it illness? They couldn't understand. And then this lady moved on to the next house, and unfortunately the same thing happened again. Now, after 3 or 4 occasions where a child would pass away when she was taken in as service, the local mob would take justice on this poor young lady. What they did is they actually came to this location and they actually chopped her head off, believing that she'd been a culprit of murder. She'd taken the life of this child. Ever since those very, very fateful days, her ghost, her energy has been seen walking up this very path. One of the most strangest things about this story is she's always seen headless. So it's our very own white headless figure of a Victorian girl walking up and down this road. So much so that even the hitchhikers, the famous stories of hitchhikers coming past and actually seeing an apparition and stopping and thinking someone's there, only to discover that the apparition has no head and drive away very, very quickly. Even famous ghost hunters have come here to spend
sounds like
time,
Ichabod
and I'm
Crane.
sure there's even recordings of
The Headless Horseman.
babies crying and almost gurgling coming from here. Now, one of the stories of the murder was she'd actually take them to a local stream, local river, and actually drown them, which was very weird. As I said, it was a weird sort of set of circumstances that sort of took place, but a very own serial killer that was supposed to be here right after the Pendle Witches.
And what happened with the well? What's the connection?
There's different areas where she's supposed to have drowned them, and as I said, they died in mysterious ways, so it wasn't always that, but her ghostly figure was found here when they actually decapitated her. So it's all sort of tied in weird phenomena.
So this is where her body was.
This is where her body
where they chopped her head off.
Right on this lane is quite long. It's about a mile long, so you can walk all the way down to the bottom and all the way up. So a ghost is seen all the way down. Her body was discovered here during Victorian times, and as I said, mob justice took over. If you're a parent, I'm sure people would understand, but obviously today everyone has different ideas.
And just to reiterate, this is where they say her headless corpse was.
Where a headless corpse was. There's been reports of baby sounds, gurgling also. As I said, there's reports of a child actually being murdered here as well, at the actual well. Obviously a lot of it's changed during the since the Victorian time. There's actually a river that runs straight through. You'll see most of it as we go through as well. So,
And this is it. Can you point out the well?
right here, right next to us, but the back. Sometimes when it does rain quite well, it floods and it runs all the way down as well. But as I said, there's a field right behind, there's public access that we tend to go up. You can spend time in there as well, just listening out. As you can hear, there's nothing apart from our cars There's nothing. A few houses behind us now, you never hear from anyone outside. So that faint sound of children, of crying, often comes from here. As I said, the young girl is never heard.
Creepy stories.
Creepy stories.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. Renting the old, quaint house for the summer felt like stepping into a different world. Nestled in the countryside, it was everything I'd hoped for, a perfect escape from the chaos of city life. The house had charm, with its ivy-covered walls, creaky wooden floors, and the scent of blooming flowers drifting through the open windows. The days passed in a peaceful rhythm, each one filled with long walks through the surrounding fields, quiet evenings with a good book, and the simple pleasure of solitude. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, something hidden just beneath the surface of this idyllic retreat. It wasn't long before I discovered it. I first noticed the door in the basement a few days after I moved in. I had been storing some of my things down there, organizing boxes in the dim light cast by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The basement was unfinished, with concrete walls and a damp, musty smell that clung to the air. It was the kind of place that felt like it had secrets, and it wasn't long before I found one. The door was small, almost hidden in the shadows at the far end of the basement.
This guy is called
It was
Midnight
made of
Horror.
heavy wood, with an old-fashioned brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. Curious, I reached out to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked. When I asked the landlord about it the next day, he was curt. "That room is off limits," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It's not part of the rental agreement. Just leave it alone." His response only fueled my curiosity. What could possibly be in that
And again,
room?
yes, I switched it.
I couldn't stop
might
thinking
like this.
about it. Every time I went down to the basement, my eyes would drift toward the door, my mind spinning with possibilities. What was he hiding? One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, I found the key. It was tucked away in the back of a kitchen drawer, almost as if someone had hidden it there. The moment I saw it, I knew what it was for. The temptation was too strong to resist. My heart raced as I took the key down to the basement, the old stairs creaking underfoot. I hesitated in front of the door, the key cold in my hand. Part of me knew I should leave it alone, respect the landlord's wishes. But my curiosity won out in the end. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft click, revealing a room that was unlike anything else in the house. It was pristine, a stark contrast to the rest of the dusty basement. The air was cool and still, as if the room had been sealed off from the world for years. Everything was meticulously arranged: a small table with a chair, shelves lined with old books and trinkets, and a large cabinet against the far wall. But what caught my attention were the photographs. They were everywhere, covering the walls, the shelves, even the floor. Hundreds of them, all in black and white, neatly framed and arranged in rows. And they were all of me.
What?
A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the images. They were taken from various angles: me walking in the garden, sitting on the porch, reading in the living room. Some were
Stalker
recent,
vibe.
others looked like they had been taken the moment I arrived. The more I looked, the more unsettled I became. Who had taken these? How had I not noticed someone watching me? My breath quickened as I realized that some of the photos were from inside the house. There were pictures of me cooking in the kitchen, lounging in the living room, even sitting at the desk in the study. The angles were strange. almost voyeuristic, as if the photographer had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to capture me. I couldn't bear it any longer. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it and hurried back upstairs, key heavy in my pocket. I shoved it back into the drawer where I had found it, as if returning it to its hiding place could somehow erase what I had seen. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. I kept expecting to hear footsteps in the hallway, the sound of someone sneaking through the house. But the night passed in silence, the house as still as ever. The next morning I tried to convince myself that it had all been a mistake, a misunderstanding. Perhaps the photos had been left by a previous tenant, someone who had an unusual hobby. Maybe the landlord didn't even know about them. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. When I finally worked up the courage to return to the basement, the door to the locked room was just as I had left it. I stood there for a long moment, my hand on the key, debating whether or not to go back inside. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, to pretend I had never found it, but I had to know. I opened the door, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was exactly the same, except for one horrifying detail. The photographs had been replaced. The new ones were in color, the images sharp and clear, and they were all of me, asleep in my bed. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at the photos, each one taken from a different angle, as if someone had been standing right next to me while I slept. The sheets were the same, the position of my body identical to how I remembered lying the night before. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Someone had been in my room while I slept. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the threshold as I fled the room. The key slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor, but I didn't care. I bolted up the stairs, my mind racing with fear. I had to get out of there. Within the hour, I had packed my things and was in my car, speeding away from the house as fast as I could. I didn't tell the landlord why I was leaving early, didn't even bother to ask for a refund. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there another night. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the window, watching me leave. But the house remained still and silent, its secrets hidden behind its quaint exterior. I never found out who took those photos or why they were there. But the memory of that room and the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I left. I learned a valuable lesson that summersome doors are better left locked. Story 2. At work, everything was routine. I'd been with the company for a few years, settling into the predictable of my daily tasks. My desk, nestled in a quiet corner of the office, had become a second home, with photos of family and a few plants to liven up the space. I'd never had any reason to feel uneasy there until the notes started appearing. It was a Monday morning when I found the first one. I arrived at my desk, set my coffee down, and opened my drawer to grab a pen. Inside was a small folded piece of paper. My name was scrawled on the front in neat handwriting. At first, I thought it was a harmless joke, maybe a leftover from a team-building exercise I'd forgotten about. But as I unfolded the note, a chill ran down my spine. The message inside was brief but unsettling. I know what you did last summer. My mind raced. What could this mean? I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary the previous summer, no secrets, no scandals. Just a normal vacation with friends. I laughed it off, chalking it up to a prank by a coworker with a strange sense of humor. I crumpled up the note and tossed it in the trash, determined to forget about it. But the notes kept coming. Every few days I'd find a new one waiting for me. They appeared in my desk drawer, slipped between papers, or even tucked under my keyboard. Each note was more personal, containing details that no one else should know. My childhood fears, my anxieties, even things I had never spoken aloud to anyone. The handwriting was always the same, perfectly neat, with a slight slant that was unfamiliar to me. The messages, however, were anything but neat. They hinted at my insecurities, my deepest fears, and always ended with a vague but unsettling statement, like I'm closer than you think or you can't hide from me. By the third note, I started to grow paranoid. I began looking around the office, trying to catch a glimpse of someone watching me or sneaking away from my desk, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Everyone went about their business as usual, oblivious to the turmoil churning inside me. I confided in a close friend at work, Sarah, hoping she might have some insight. She listened intently, her brow furrowed in concern. "Are you sure it's not just someone playing a prank on you?" she asked, trying to reassure me. But the look in her eyes told me she was just as unnerved as I was. "Maybe you should talk to HR," she suggested. So I did. I went to HR, feeling a bit foolish but needing to do something to regain control over the situation. The HR manager, a stern woman named Mrs. Dempsey, listened to my concerns with a stony expression. She assured me that they would look into it and asked if I had any idea who might be responsible. But I didn't. I had no enemies at work, no one who would go to such lengths to unnerve me. Days passed after my meeting with HR, and I heard nothing. No updates, no explanations. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Every time I opened my desk drawer, my heart would race, expecting another note. But for a while, there were none. Just as I started to convince myself that it was over, that maybe HR had quietly dealt with the issue, the notes returned. This time they were worse. The messages were no longer just cryptic, they were disturbing. One note simply read, "I know you're scared," and another, "You're not safe here." The last straw came one Friday afternoon. It had been a long week, and I was exhausted. As I sat at my desk trying to focus on finishing a report, I opened my drawer to grab a file and found another note. My breath caught in my throat as I read it. "I'm watching you right now." The words sent a jolt of fear through me. I felt a sudden, intense pressure on my chest, like a weight pressing down. My hands trembled as I clutched the note, my mind racing. The room felt suffocating, and the air was thick with tension. I felt it a gaze on me, heavy and invasive. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned around, expecting to find someone standing there, staring at me. But the office was empty. The cubicles were deserted, the usual hum of conversations and ringing phones replaced by an eerie silence. It was late in the afternoon, and most of my colleagues had already left for the weekend. The lights overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the room. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked around my desk, scanning every corner of the office. I checked behind partitions, peered into empty conference rooms, even looked out the windows, but there was no one. The feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at me, but I couldn't find a single soul.
In the middle of nowhere.
My rational mind told me it was just my imagination, fueled by the paranoia the notes had stirred up. But a deeper, more primal part of me
Once you
knew
get
better.
into the city, it gets bad.
Unable to shake the fear, I gathered my things and left the office in a hurry. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see or not see if I did. That weekend, I barely slept, haunted by the thought that someone out there knew me, knew my fears, and was toying with me. When Monday came, I dreaded returning to work. When I arrived, my desk was just as I had left it. I hesitated before opening the drawer, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no new note, no sign that anything had been disturbed. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of relief until I noticed something else. The note from Friday was gone. The one that had said, "I'm watching you right now," I had left it in the drawer. But now, it was missing. Someone had taken it. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. Whoever was doing this was closer than I had ever imagined. I went back to HR, demanding answers, but Mrs. Dempsey seemed more annoyed than concerned. "We've checked the security footage," she said curtly. "No one has been tampering with your desk. Are you sure you didn't misplace the notes yourself?" Her words stung, and I left the office feeling more alone than ever. The notes had stopped, but the fear remained. I could no longer concentrate at work, always feeling on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I never found out who was behind the notes or how they knew such intimate details about my life, but the experience left a scar, a lingering sense of unease that I could never quite shake. Even now, I sometimes catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me from the shadows.
I wonder on something.
Story 3.
Saying next to FedEx, I wonder.
The first time the house alarm went off in the middle of the night, I dismissed it as a glitch. I had just moved into the old house a few weeks ago, and though the previous owner assured me that everything was in working order, I figured the alarm system was just showing its age. Groggy and half asleep, I shuffled downstairs to disarm the alarm, my heart pounding in my chest from the sudden jolt. I checked every window and door, making sure they were all locked and secure. Everything seemed fine, so I chalked it up to a technical error and went back to bed. But it didn't stop there. The alarm continued to go off night after night, always at the same time, 2:47 a.m. Every time it happened, I would get up, go through the house, and find nothing out of place. I even called the alarm company, and they sent a technician to inspect the system. He found no issues, no signs of tampering or malfunction. Yet the alarm persisted, as if it had a mind of its own. One night, about a week after the alarm first started acting up, I found myself in the basement, organizing some old boxes left behind by the previous owner. I lost track of time, sorting through dusty memorabilia, when I heard the sound of someone moving around upstairs. The soft creak of floorboards, the faint shuffle of footsteps. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. The footsteps were deliberate, not like the random settling of an old house, but the measured tread of someone walking through the rooms. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that there was someone in my house. She told me to stay on the line and remain quiet until the police arrived. I could still hear the footsteps overhead, moving from the kitchen to the living room, then toward the staircase. My mind raced as I crouched behind a stack of boxes, praying that whoever was upstairs wouldn't come down to the basement. The minutes dragged on like hours, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside, followed by the slamming of doors. The police were here. Relief washed over me, but the footsteps continued, undisturbed by the arrival of the authorities. I stayed hidden until I heard the officers calling out, announcing their presence. Only then did I emerge from the basement, my hands trembling as I climbed the stairs to meet them. The officers searched the entire house, room by room, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been inside. They checked the windows and doors just as I had, and everything was secure. They even reviewed the security footage from the cameras I had installed around the house. But the footage showed nothing, no one entering or leaving, no shadowy figures creeping through the halls. It was as if the sounds I had heard were all in my head. But I knew they
It's
weren't.
Casper the Friendly Ghost.
I had heard those footsteps, felt the presence of someone or something moving through my home. The officers tried to reassure me, suggesting that perhaps it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside that I had mistaken for an intruder. But I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was overreacting, that maybe I was just spooked from living alone in an unfamiliar place. After the police left, I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that maybe they were right. Maybe I was just hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong with the house, something I couldn't explain. The alarm kept going off, always at 2:47 a.m., and every time it did, I felt that same cold dread wash over me. A few nights later, I decided to stay up and watch the security footage in real time, determined to catch whatever was triggering the alarm. I sat in front of the monitor, the house dark and silent around me, the only light coming from the screen. 2 2:47 a.m. came and went, and for a moment I thought maybe the disturbances had stopped, but then the alarm blared, shattering the silence. I quickly rewound the footage, my eyes scanning the screen for any sign of movement. There was nothing, no intruder, no animal, nothing that could have set off the alarm. But as I listened closely, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. Faint, almost imperceptible, there were footsteps, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. They were there on the recording, yet when I played it back for anyone else, they heard nothing. It was as if the sounds were meant for me alone. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I became obsessed with the alarm and the footsteps, spending hours watching the footage, trying to catch even the smallest anomaly. But no matter how many times I watched, the result was always the same, nothing visible, only those faint, ghostly footsteps echoing through the house. I started to avoid going to bed, dreading the moment when the alarm would go off again. I'd lie awake, listening, waiting for the footsteps to start. Sometimes, I thought I could hear whispers too, just on the edge of hearing, as if someone were trying to speak to me from the other side of the walls. But the words were always just out of reach, leaving me with nothing but a growing sense of unease. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left the house, staying with a friend while I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't live like that, constantly on edge, feeling like I was being watched, haunted by something I couldn't see. I called in another technician, another round of police, but nothing helped. The alarm continued to malfunction, the footsteps continued to echo in the recordings, and I knew that whatever was in the house, it wasn't going to leave me alone. The final night I spent in that house, the alarm went off at 2:47 a.m. As usual, but this time, when I listened to the recording, the footsteps were louder, clearer, as if they were right beside me. And this time I heard something else, too, a low, guttural whisper. Just one word, but it was enough to send me fleeing into the night. Leave. Story 4. It had been an ordinary night out with friends, dinner at our favorite restaurant, followed by drinks at a local bar. The laughter, the stories, the easy camaraderie, all of it had made the evening one of those perfect nights that left you smiling long after it was over. But that happiness shattered the moment I reached for my wallet the next morning and found it missing. At first, I thought I had simply misplaced it. I retraced my steps, searching through my apartment, checking every pocket, every corner, every possible place it could have fallen. I even called the restaurant and the bar, hoping that someone had found it and turned it in. But it was nowhere to be found. As the day wore on, the sinking realization that my wallet was gone for good settled in. I had no choice but to report it stolen. I canceled my credit cards, filed a police report, and began the tedious process of replacing my ID and other important documents. The inconvenience was bad enough, but what truly bothered me was the thought of someone out there having access to my personal information, someone who could be using it for who knows what purpose. A few days later, as I was heading out for work, I noticed an envelope slipped under my front door. It was unmarked, no return address, just a plain white envelope with my name scrawled across the front in messy handwriting. Puzzled, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was my wallet. For a moment, relief washed over me until I opened it and saw that it had been emptied of all its contents. My credit cards, ID, cash, everything was gone, except for a single slip of paper tucked into one of the card slots. I pulled it out, and my heart skipped a beat as I read the message written on it in large, bold letters, "I know where you live." A cold shiver ran down my spine, and my hand shook as I held the note. The words were simple but filled with a menacing certainty that made my blood run cold. Someone had gone through the trouble of stealing my wallet, removing all its contents, and then returning it to me with this chilling message. Whoever it was, they knew where I lived. They had been to my home, close enough to slip the envelope under my door without me noticing. Fear gripped me as I stared at the note, my mind racing with questions. Who had done this? Why would they return the wallet? What did they want? But no matter how hard I tried to piece it together, I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that I was no longer safe in my own home. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart pound. I barely slept, jumping at every little sound, convinced that someone was trying to break in. I decided to take action. The first thing I did was change the locks on my door. The idea that someone might have a key to my apartment filled me with dread, so I had a locksmith come out immediately. I watched as he installed the new locks, double-checking to make sure everything was secure, but even that didn't fully ease my fears. Next, I moved some of my belongings to a friend's place. I didn't have the time or resources to relocate entirely, but I thought if I could make it look like I wasn't staying there full-time, it might deter whoever was watching me. I packed up some clothes, important documents, and anything of value, and spent a few nights crashing on my friend's couch. But the fear followed me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was away from home. I also installed a security system with cameras, motion detectors, and alarms. The company assured me that my apartment was now one of the safest in the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I entered my apartment, I checked the footage from the cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had left that note. But nothing ever showed up. It was as if the person had simply vanished, leaving me in a state of perpetual dread. The days turned into weeks, and gradually the intensity of my fear began to subside, though it never completely disappeared. I started to regain some sense of normalcy, though I remained hyper-vigilant. I avoided going out late at night, kept my curtains drawn, and checked the locks multiple times before going to bed. But the memory of that note haunted me, a constant reminder that someone out there had invaded my life in the most personal way possible. I became obsessed with trying to figure out who had done it. I went over every detail of that night out with friends, trying to remember if anyone had been acting strangely, or if I had seen anyone following me. But nothing stood out. I even considered the possibility that it was some kind of sick joke, but the note didn't feel like a prank, it felt like a threat, one that I couldn't ignore. Months passed, and while the fear no longer consumed me, it had left its mark. I was more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and less trusting of others. The feeling of being watched never completely left me, lurking in the back of my mind like a shadow. I knew I had to move on, but part of me would always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if that anonymous threat would ever come to pass. In the end, I never found out who took my wallet or why they returned it with that ominous note. The mystery remained unsolved, a lingering question with no answer. But the experience changed me. It made me realize how vulnerable we can be, how easily our sense of security can be shattered by a single, anonymous act. And it taught me to be more careful, to never take my safety for granted, because once you've been marked, the fear of what might happen next never truly goes away. Story 5. The first text came on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk finishing up some emails when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another spam message, but something made me pause. I opened it, expecting the usual nonsense, but what I read made my skin crawl. Nice blue shirt today. You look good in that color. I frowned, looking down at my blue shirt. It wasn't an unusual outfit choice, and it could have been a coincidence, but something about the message felt off. How did this person know what I was wearing? I looked around the office, trying to spot anyone acting suspicious, but everyone was engrossed in their work. I dismissed it as a weird prank and went back to my tasks. But the messages didn't stop. Over the next few days, more texts came in, each one more unsettling than the last. They detailed my routines, places I'd been, and even conversations I'd had. One morning I received a text that read, "Did you enjoy your coffee at the corner cafe? The barista gave you an extra shot. Didn't she? I had indeed stopped at the cafe that morning, and the barista had given me an extra shot of espresso." My heart raced as I reread the message. How did they know that? I hadn't told anyone. At first, I tried to brush it off as a prank. Maybe a friend was playing a joke on me, or perhaps it was someone in the office who'd seen me at the cafe. But as the days passed, the messages grew more specific, more personal. They started predicting things that would happen to me, minor accidents, small misfortunes that, while not life-threatening, were certainly unsettling. One day, as I was leaving for work, I received a text, "Be careful on your way out. You might trip on the last step." I paused at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The last step of the staircase had always been a bit tricky, but I'd never tripped on it before. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as I descended the stairs, I hesitated at the last step, and in my hesitation I lost my balance. I stumbled, catching myself on the banister just in time. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the bottom, the words of the text echoing in my mind. I decided to take action. I tried tracing the number, but every attempt led to a dead end. It was as if the number didn't exist, a ghost in the system. I reported the text to the police, but without any real threat, they couldn't do much. They suggested I change my number, but I hesitated. Part of me wanted to know who was behind this. The idea that someone was watching me, knowing so much about my life, was terrifying, but I also needed answers. The texts continued, each one a reminder that someone was out there, observing me. "You're running late today. Maybe skip the coffee and catch the earlier train." Text predicting delays, weather changes, and even the arrival of a package I hadn't been expecting. I started feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. How could someone know so much? How could they predict these things with such accuracy? I began to withdraw, avoiding my usual routines, hoping to throw off whoever was watching me. I changed my commute, stopped going to my favorite spots, even started taking different routes home. But the texts followed me, commenting on my new routines, almost as if they were taunting me for trying to escape. "Nice try with a detour, but I still see you." Sleep became elusive. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, and I'd dread what I might read. The constant anxiety wore me down, and I found myself jumping at shadows, seeing threats where there were none. I even considered leaving town for a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was sending the text would still find me, no matter where I went. Then, just as abruptly as they had started, the texts stopped. I noticed it one day when I realized that I hadn't received a message in over 24 hours. At first, I felt a sense of relief, thinking that maybe, finally, it was over. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Why had they stopped? Had they moved on to someone else, or was this part of some larger plan? The days turned into weeks, and still there were no more texts. I began to relax, though the memory of those weeks of torment lingered. The silence, however, was almost worse than the texts themselves. I found myself constantly on edge, waiting for the next message, the next sign that someone was still watching, but nothing came. As the weeks passed, I tried to return to my normal life, but the knowledge that someone had known so much about me, had predicted so many of my movements, weighed heavily on me. I became more cautious, more guarded, not just with my routines, but with the people around me.
It's actually several
The experience had shaken me to my core, leaving a scar that time would never fully heal. One night, months later, I was sitting alone in my apartment. The memory of the texts a distant, but ever-present, shadow in my mind. My phone buzzed on the table, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at the screen, the familiar anxiety flooding back in an instant. But when I picked it up, it was just a notification from a friend, nothing more. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. But as I set the phone down, a single thought lingered, chilling me to the bone. Somewhere out there, someone still knew too much about me. Story 6. When I first moved into my new neighborhood, I was thrilled. The tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and friendly faces made it feel like the perfect place to start fresh. My small house at the end of the cul-de-sac felt cozy and inviting, and I quickly settled into a comfortable routine. The neighbors were welcoming, especially the man living next door. He introduced himself as Alan, a middle-aged man with a warm smile and a seemingly genuine interest in helping me get acclimated to the area. At first, I appreciated Alan's friendliness. He offered to help with my yard work, invited me over for coffee, and provided recommendations for local services. It was nice to have someone so willing to lend a hand, especially when you're new to a place. We'd chat occasionally over the fence, and he always seemed eager to learn more about me where I worked, my hobbies, and even my family background. I found his interest a bit excessive, but I dismissed it as harmless neighborly curiosity. However, as the weeks passed, Alan's behavior began to shift from friendly to unsettling. He started asking increasingly personal questions. He wanted to know the details of my work schedule, the names of my friends, and even why I wasn't dating anyone. His questions were intrusive, and I began to feel uncomfortable with how much he wanted to know about my life. There was something about the way he asked an intensity in his eyes that made me uneasy. I tried to distance myself, making excuses when he invited me over or tried to engage in long conversations, but Alan was persistent. He always seemed to be outside when I left for work or returned home, waving and calling out to me as if he were watching for my comings and goings. The feeling that he was always there, always watching, became harder to shake.
Yeah, like I said, it's numerous stories.
Then one day I found something that made my blood run cold.
This whole
It was a Sunday morning, and I was tidying up my front porch, arranging the flower pots that lined the steps.
Just enjoy the videos.
As I bent down to move one of the pots, something metallic caught my eye. Hidden behind the leaves was a small black object. I picked it up, and my heart skipped a beat when I realized what it was: a camera. A tiny, discreet camera, positioned perfectly to capture everything happening in my front door.
Whoa.
My hands trembled as I held the camera, a sickening feeling of violation washing over me. Someone had been watching me, recording my every move as I entered and left my home. The sense of safety I had once felt in my own space was shattered in an instant. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Alan's odd behavior, his obsession with my routine, it all pointed to him. But why? What was he hoping to gain by invading my privacy like this? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more disturbing than the last. With a deep breath, I decided I couldn't ignore it. I needed answers. I marched over to Alan's house, camera in hand, and knocked on the door. When he opened it, his expression shifted from surprise to something else, something I couldn't quite place. I found this, I said, holding up the camera. It was hidden behind a flower pot on my porch. Care to explain? For a moment, Alan's face was blank, as if he was processing the situation. Then, he let out a nervous laugh. Oh, that? It's just for security purposes. You can never be too careful these days, right? I stared at him, disbelief and anger boiling inside me. Security purposes? You've been spying on me. That's not normal, Alan. That's not okay. Alan's smile faltered, and his eyes took on a pleading look. I didn't mean to upset you. I was just trying to look out for you. You're new here. and I thought it would be good to keep an eye on things. In case anything happened. His words did little to ease my anger. If anything, they only made me feel more uneasy. This wasn't about security, this was about control. He wanted to know everything about me, to monitor my every move, and that was something I couldn't tolerate. I'm not comfortable with this, I said firmly. You had no right to put a camera on my property without my consent. I want you to remove any other cameras you might have placed and leave me alone. Do you understand? Alan's face darkened, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something cold in his eyes. But then he nodded, his expression softening back into that friendly, almost apologetic demeanor. Of course, I'm sorry. I'll remove the camera. It won't happen again. I didn't trust him. There was something about his quick change in demeanor that felt disingenuous, like he was just telling me what I wanted to hear. But I had made my point, and I hoped that would be the end of it. Over the next few days, I kept a close eye on my surroundings, wary of any further invasions of my privacy. Alan stayed out of sight, and I didn't see him lurking around as he used to. But the sense of unease didn't fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even when there was no one around. That's when I decided it was time to move. The thought of staying in a place where someone had violated my privacy so blatantly was too much to bear. I found a new apartment across town and packed my things as quickly as I could. As I drove away from that house for the last time, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Moving was the right choice, but the experience had left a lasting mark. The idea that someone had been watching me so closely, so obsessively, was haunting. Even in my new home, far from Alan's prying eyes, I found myself constantly checking the windows, scanning for hidden cameras, and feeling a chill whenever I thought I saw a shadow move outside. Alan was just a neighbor, a man who had seemed friendly and harmless at first. But beneath that facade was something darker, something that made me question everyone around me, wondering what secrets they might be hiding behind their smiles. Story 7. It started innocently enough, just a small annoyance that I shrugged off without much thought. My phone would ring late at night, always from an unknown number. At first, I assumed it was some telemarketer who had managed to slip through my call filters, or perhaps someone dialing the wrong number. When I answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end. I would wait a few seconds, say hello a couple of times, and then hang up when no one responded. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it. The calls persisted, always at odd hours. They came just as I was settling into bed, my eyes heavy with sleep. It wasn't every night, but often enough that I began to dread the sound of my phone ringing. Each time, the same routine played out. My phone would light up, I would answer, and there would be nothing but silence on the other end. After a week of this, I decided to trace the number. I figured it couldn't hurt to know who or what was behind these calls. I used one of those online services that claimed to trace unknown numbers. But when the results came back, they showed nothing. No name, no address, not even a location. It was as if the number didn't exist. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong, but I dismissed it as just another glitch in the system. The next night, the calls continued, but something had changed. Instead of the usual silence, I started hearing strange noises like breathing or faint whispers just before the line went dead. The first time it happened, I felt a chill run down my spine. The breathing was slow, deliberate, like someone was listening closely, waiting for something. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the screen as if it would somehow reveal the identity of the caller. But it was just the same unknown number. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, even though I was alone in my apartment. I began to check the locks on my doors and windows every night, making sure they were secure. I even started keeping a small lamp on beside my bed, the soft glow comforting me in the darkness. But the calls continued, relentless and unsettling. A few days later, I told my friend Kate about what was happening. We were sitting in a coffee shop, the bustle of the city around us providing a stark contrast to the eerie silence of those late-night calls. "That's creepy," she said, her eyes wide. "Have you thought about changing your number?" "I have, but something's stopping me," I admitted, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly. "It's like I need to know who's behind these calls and under my skin." Kate gave me a concerned look. "You should be careful. It might be some kind of prank, but it could also be something more serious." I nodded, but I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just ignore the calls, not when they were beginning to feel so personal. There was a growing unease in the pit of my stomach, a sense that something was very wrong. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, my phone in hand, waiting. The clock ticked past midnight, and just as I was about to give up and go to sleep, it rang. My heart jumped in my chest as I saw the familiar unknown number flash on the screen. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling slightly. For a few seconds, there was nothing, just the familiar silence. Then I heard it. The breathing. Slow, steady, and unnervingly close. It sent shivers down my spine, my body tensing as I strained to hear anything else. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why are you calling me?" The breathing continued, unchanging, as if my questions had no effect. I was about to hang up when I heard something else, a faint whisper, too quiet to make out. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my heart pounding. "What did you say?" I whispered, fear and frustration mixing in my voice. There was a pause, and then the whisper came again, louder this time, clear enough for me to understand. It was my name. "Mika." The voice was low, almost a hiss, and it sounded so familiar, but I couldn't place it. My blood ran cold, and I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. The call ended abruptly, the screen going dark as the phone landed on the bed. I sat there, frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. How did they know my name? I felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone had reached into my life and pulled out something deeply personal. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. I kept the lamp on, the light doing little to chase away the fear that had taken root in my mind. I tried to tell myself it was just a cruel prank, that someone was messing with me. But deep down, I knew there was more to it than that. The next day, I went to the police. I told them about the calls, the strange noises, and the voice that whispered my name. The officer I spoke to was polite but dismissive. He suggested that it was probably a prank or a glitch, and that I should block the number and change my phone number if it continued. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more than a simple prank. I blocked the number as the officer suggested, but a part of me dreaded the silence that might follow. As unsettling as the calls were, the idea of not knowing who was behind them or why they were calling was somehow worse. That night, my phone didn't ring. I sat in bed, staring at the screen, half expecting it to light up with that unknown number, but it remained dark. I should have felt relieved, but instead I was on edge, as if waiting for something to happen. Just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed with a text message. My heart skipped a beat as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The message was from an unknown number, but this time, it wasn't the same one as before. The message was short, just 2 words, "Miss me." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen. The message felt like a taunt, a reminder that whoever was behind the calls wasn't finished with me yet. I quickly blocked the number, but it did little to ease my fear. I spent the next few nights on high alert, jumping at every little sound, unable to relax. The calls had stopped, but the unease lingered, a constant presence in the back of my mind. I began to wonder if I would ever feel safe again. A week passed with no further contact. I started to think that maybe it was over, that whoever had been tormenting me had moved on, but the sense of dread never fully left. I kept my phone close, waiting for the next call or message, knowing that it could come at any time. And then, just as I was beginning to let my guard down, my phone rang again. I looked at the screen, my stomach twisting in knots. The number was unknown, but different from the previous ones. With a deep breath, I answered the call. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment I thought it was just another dead line. But then, I heard my name, whispered in that same familiar racing. Whoever it was, they weren't done with me yet. I knew then that this wasn't just a random prank. Someone was watching me, someone who knew my name, my habits, my life. And they weren't going to stop. The calls continued, each one more terrifying than the last. I stopped answering, but they kept coming, relentless and unnerving. Which became more frequent, the breathing more labored, as if whoever was on the other end was getting closer and closer. I changed my number, but it didn't help. The calls still found me, no matter what I did. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being hunted, that someone was out there, watching and waiting. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I know one thing for sure: they're not going to stop. Not until they get what they're after. And that's the most terrifying part of all. Story 8. It started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had just gotten home from work, soaked from the downpour, when I noticed a package sitting on my doorstep. There was no return address, no tracking information, just my name scrawled in a hurried, almost illegible script. Puzzled, I brought it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. The cardboard was damp from the rain, and I hesitated for a moment before deciding to open it. Inside, nestled among crumpled newspaper, was a doll. It was unlike any doll I had seen before. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, with a fixed, eerie smile that sent a shiver down my spine. The clothes it wore were old-fashioned, a frilly dress that seemed out of place in time. The entire thing gave off an unsettling vibe, but what caught my attention most was the note that accompanied it. "I've been waiting for you." Those 5 words, written in the same hurried script as my name on the box, made my stomach churn. The message was simple but deeply unnerving. I hadn't ordered any doll, and I had no idea who would send such a thing to me, let alone with such a cryptic note. The whole situation felt wrong. I tried to shake off the unease and convince myself it was some kind of prank, but the doll's glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the apartment. Unable to bear its presence any longer, I decided to throw it away. I wrapped it in the box it came in and walked it down to the dumpster behind my building. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, making the alley feel dark and foreboding. I returned to my apartment, relieved to be rid of the doll. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something out of place. There, sitting on my dresser, was the doll. My heart skipped a beat. I was certain I had thrown it away. Panic gripped me as I approached it cautiously, as if it might suddenly move. The doll's expression hadn't changed, but it felt different now, more menacing, almost alive. I grabbed it, this time driving it to a dumpster several blocks away. I needed to make sure it was gone for good. The next day, I felt a little more at ease, convincing myself that it was just a weird coincidence. But when I returned home from work, my blood ran cold. The doll was back, sitting in the middle of my living room. I couldn't understand how it kept returning. I lived alone, and no one else had a key to my apartment. Was someone breaking in, playing a sick joke on me? my thoughts spiraled as fear and paranoia took hold. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every shadow seemed like a threat. The doll sat in the corner of the room, its unblinking eyes fixed on me. The following morning I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Keep the doll, or face the consequences." My hands trembled as I opened it, and the message inside was no less unsettling. "You've been chosen. Keep the doll, and you'll be safe. Get rid of it again, and you'll regret it." The email was untraceable, no sender information, no IP address, nothing. I felt trapped. Whoever was behind this knew where I lived, how to contact me, and possibly even my daily routine. The thought of someone watching me, knowing every move I made, sent me into a full-blown panic. I tried to ignore the email, but the warning lingered in the back of my mind, making it impossible to think clearly. Over the next few days, more emails followed, each one more threatening than the last. "You can't escape one read." Another said, "The doll belongs to you now. Don't defy its will." The messages were relentless, eroding my sense of safety and sanity. I tried blocking the address, but the emails kept coming, always from a different untraceable source. Desperate, I contacted the authorities. I showed them the doll, the emails, and explained everything that had been happening. The officers listened, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They filed a report, but without any concrete evidence or a suspect, there was little they could do. They assured me they would patrol the area more frequently, but it did little to ease my growing paranoia. The feeling of being stalked, of someone or something watching me, became overwhelming. I started noticing odd things around my apartment, objects slightly out of place, doors that I swore I had locked left ajar, and the doll, always the doll, never where I had last left it. It seemed to appear in different rooms as if it moved on its own. Sleep became a distant memory. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, every unexpected movement. The doll's presence was oppressive, its eyes following me no matter where I went. The emails had stopped, but their message was clear: the doll was mine, and there was nothing I could do about it. One night, after another fruitless attempt to sleep, I awoke to the sound of soft whispering. The room was dark, but the whispers were unmistakable, growing louder and more insistent. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and there was the doll, sitting on my bedside table, closer than it had ever been before. The whispers stopped the moment I looked at it. In the silence that followed, I realized that I couldn't live like this anymore. Whether it was a curse, a prank, or my own mind playing tricks on me, I had to get rid of the doll for good. I couldn't let it control my life any longer. The next morning, I packed a bag and left my apartment, driving out of town to a remote area. I brought the doll with me, making sure it was securely wrapped and hidden in the trunk. I found an old, abandoned quarry, far from any roads or homes, and buried the doll within the earth, covering it with heavy rocks and debris. I hoped that by leaving it in such an isolated place, I could finally break free of whatever hold it had over me. I returned home feeling a mix of relief and fear. The doll was gone, but the memories lingered. For weeks, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that at any moment, I might find the doll waiting for me again. But as time passed, the feeling slowly began to fade. Eventually, I moved to a new apartment, hoping to leave the whole experience behind. But every now and then, I still catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those unblinking eyes staring back at me. Story 9. It all started with the lock on my apartment's front door. For months it had been working fine, a simple twist of the key securing my home. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, it began to malfunction. I'd come home to find the door ajar, despite my clear memory of locking it before I left. At first, I thought it might just be a fluke, perhaps a misalignment or a minor glitch. However, as days passed, the problem became more pronounced. The door would randomly unlock itself, leaving me with an unsettling feeling each time I walked into my apartment. Determined to solve the issue, I decided to replace the lock. I purchased a new, high-quality deadbolt from a reputable store, convinced that this would put an end to my troubles. Installing the new lock was straightforward, and I felt a sense of accomplishment once it was in place. The lock clicked smoothly and securely, and I was confident that my apartment was once again safe. But as the days went by, the problem persisted. The new lock seemed to work fine at first, but soon enough, I began noticing the same issue. The door would be open when I returned home, despite my best efforts to ensure it was properly secured. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a coincidence or perhaps my own paranoia, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. One night, as I slept soundly, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. My mind raced, trying to place the sound that had disturbed my sleep. It was a low, repetitive creaking like a door moving on its hinges. My heart began to pound as I sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. I got up cautiously and walked toward the living room. When I reached the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. The front door was wide open, the darkness of the corridor outside starkly contrasting with the dim light of my apartment. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. I rushed over to close the door, my hands shaking as I locked it securely. Panic surged through me as I took in the scene before me. The living room was a mess. Cushions were thrown off the couch, books were scattered across the floor, and drawers had been pulled open, their contents strewn about. It was as if someone had been rifling through my belongings, searching for something. My pulse raced as I scanned the apartment for any sign of an intruder. Everything else seemed to be in place, but the disarray was unsettling. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every creak and groan of the building. In the morning, I decided to talk to my neighbors, hoping someone might have seen something unusual. I went door to door, describing the situation and asking if they had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Most of them looked at me with concern but shook their heads, indicating that they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. One neighbor, an elderly woman who lived 2 floors above me, mentioned hearing strange noises during the night but had thought nothing of it, assuming it was just the building settling. With no answers from my neighbors, I was left with a growing sense of unease. The problem with the door continued. Despite my best efforts to secure it, it would still unlock itself. I began to question my own sanity. Was I missing something? Had I overlooked a detail? I scrutinized the lock mechanism, checked the door frame, and even called the locksmith to ensure everything was functioning correctly. Each time they assured me that everything was in order, but the issue persisted. As weeks went by, the situation grew increasingly unnerving. The feeling of being watched became almost palpable. I started avoiding leaving my apartment for long periods and would often return early to check on things. Each time I would find the door slightly open and my belongings in disarray. The disturbances seemed to happen most often at night, which only added to my anxiety. One particularly unsettling night, I awoke to the sound of someone moving around in my apartment. I could hear footsteps, muffled and hesitant, echoing through the living room. My heart raced as I lay frozen in bed, listening to the noises. I mustered the courage to get up and check, but when I emerged, the apartment was eerily quiet. The door was shut, and everything seemed to be in place. It was as if the disturbances had never happened. I began to feel a growing sense of paranoia. Was someone trying to gain access to my apartment, or was it all in my head? I started to install additional security measures, cameras, a motion sensor, and even a temporary bar to reinforce the door. Despite these precautions, the problem remained. The door would still unlock itself, and my belongings would still be scattered, though nothing was ever stolen. In the end, I decided to move out, unable to bear the constant anxiety and the creeping sense that someone or something was trying to invade my space. My new apartment, with its solid locks and quiet corridors, felt like a sanctuary. The sense of security returned, but I couldn't shake the memory of those unsettling nights. The door, which had once been a simple barrier, had become a symbol of something far more sinister. And though I tried to put it behind me, the echoes of those disturbed nights lingered in the back of my mind, a haunting reminder of the fear that had taken root in my old apartment. Story 10. It started with the little things. I didn't think much of it at first. Who does? It's easy to misplace a set of keys or the remote control. Everyone has those moments of forgetfulness, right? You put something down, get distracted, and then spend half an hour retracing your steps, trying to remember where you left it. But then it kept happening. One evening, I came home from work, tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter, and went about my usual routine, changing out of my work clothes, checking the mail, and settling in to watch some TV. But when I went to grab the remote, it wasn't on the coffee table where I always left it. I checked the couch cushions, the floor, even the kitchen counter where I had just been. It was gone. Frustrated, I searched the entire living room, growing more agitated by the minute. I could have sworn I left the remote right there, in its usual spot, but after nearly an hour of looking, I gave up. The next morning, there it was, sitting neatly on the coffee table, exactly where I'd been sure it wasn't the night before. A sense of unease settled in my chest, but I pushed it aside. I had probably just overlooked it, too tired to notice in the dim light. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. Still, I forced myself to move on. Then it happened again. And again. My keys, the remote, a pair of reading glasses, a book when been in the middle of all of them disappeared, only to reappear later in the most obvious of places, right where I'd already searched. It was maddening. Every time, I felt a little more like I was losing my mind. I started questioning my own memory, wondering if I was really as forgetful as it seemed. But the part that gnawed at me most was the growing feeling that this wasn't just forgetfulness. It was deliberate. It felt as though something was moving my things on purpose, playing with me. The thought made my skin crawl, but I tried to shake it off. What else could it be? I lived alone, after all. Then one day I reached into a kitchen drawer for a pen and found something else instead. A folded piece of paper tucked neatly beneath the silverware tray. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded it, dreading what I might find. The note was handwritten, in a neat, almost elegant script you'll never find what you're looking for. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. This wasn't some prank. This was real. Someone had been in my house. Someone had written this and left it for me to find. The implications hit me all at once. I wasn't just misplacing things. Someone had been moving them, watching me search, and leaving this note to taunt me. I stood frozen in the kitchen, clutching the note, my eyes darting around the room, as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was no one. The house was as still and silent as ever. But the silence felt different now, heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I spent the rest of the day checking every corner of my house, looking for signs of an intruder. I checked windows, doors, even the vents, but found nothing. Everything was locked, secure, just as it had been. Yet the note remained in my hand, an undeniable sign that someone had been here. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the house that night. The thought of staying there, alone, with the possibility of someone watching me, was unbearable. I packed a bag and checked into a hotel, telling myself I just needed some time to think, to figure out what to do next. Over the next few days, I avoided going home as much as possible. I contacted the police, who came by to inspect the house. They found no signs of forced entry, nothing unusual, and certainly no evidence of anyone else being in the house. They suggested I might have misplaced the note myself, or that it could have been left by a previous tenant. But I knew that wasn't the case. I had lived there for years, and that note wasn't there before. The police left, and I was alone again. Alone with the growing sense that I was being watched. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside. I jumped at shadows, flinched at my own reflection, and barely slept. Despite my fear, I had to return home eventually. I couldn't stay at the hotel forever. But when I walked through the front door, I was hit with a wave of dread. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a stranger's, like it belonged to someone or something else. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but nothing felt normal. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense that my every move was being observed. The missing items continued to vanish and reappear, always in places I was sure I hadn't left them. It was driving me to the brink of madness. Then one evening, after yet another fruitless search for my missing keys, I found another note. This one was in the same drawer, folded neatly like the first. My hands trembled as I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. Stop looking. I dropped the note as if it had burned me, my pulse racing. The message was clear. Whoever or whatever was doing this didn't want me to figure it out. I didn't know what would happen if I did, but I was certain I didn't want to find out. I packed my bags that night. I left the house, unable to live in the suffocating atmosphere any longer. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw a shadow moving in one of the upstairs windows. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know what was in that house, and I don't want to know. I've moved far away, started fresh, and I've done my best to forget what happened. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I still feel like I'm being watched. And I can't help but wonder if whatever was in that house followed me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Story 11. The crisp morning air invigorated me as I set out on my usual jogging route, the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement a comforting routine. It was a beautiful morning, the kind that promised a day full of possibility. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, with a few early risers tending to their gardens or walking their dogs. I was lost in the simplicity of the moment when I first noticed him. He was a man in a hooded jacket, standing at the edge of the park. At first, I dismissed him as just another passerby, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood there, unmoving and silent. His hood was pulled low over his face, casting his features in shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, but when I glanced back, he simply remained still, his gaze hidden. The next day, the same man appeared again, this time standing near the corner of my usual route. His presence was more pronounced this time, his form stark against the early morning light. He was in the same hooded jacket, and though I couldn't see his face, I could feel his eyes on me. I quickened my pace, trying to push the uneasy feeling away. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps a coincidence. But the pattern was unmistakable each day. He appeared in a different spot along my route, always at the periphery of my vision, always watching. I began to feel a creeping sense of paranoia. Was he following me? Or was I simply becoming overly sensitive to his presence? The fact that he never approached or said anything only added to the eerie feeling. He was like a shadow, always there but never quite engaging. The more I tried to ignore him, the more his presence seemed to loom over my runs. One morning, as I pushed through my routine, I saw him again, but this time he was in my neighborhood. I had ventured miles from my usual jogging route, taking a different path through unfamiliar streets, hoping to shake off the feeling of being followed. And yet there he was, standing on the sidewalk just ahead of me, his hood pulled low and his posture as unnerving as ever. Panic surged through me. My heart raced as I considered the implications. How had he found me here? Did he follow me? Or was it all just an unsettling coincidence? My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them offered any comfort. I reached for my phone, dialing the police as I continued jogging, trying to maintain a steady pace despite the growing anxiety. When I reported the man, I described him as best as I could a man in a hooded jacket, standing still and watching from a distance. The dispatcher assured me that they would send someone to check the area. I finished my run with a sense of dread, my thoughts consumed by the encounter. When the police arrived, they questioned me further and took down my description, but their search turned up nothing. They couldn't find anyone fitting the description, and the feeling of being followed seemed to dissolve into the morning mist. Relieved but unsettled, I decided to change my jogging route, hoping to escape the shadow that had begun to haunt my mornings. I found a new path through a different park, surrounded by trees and less frequented by others. For a while, I felt a sense of reprieve. The man didn't appear, and I began to relax, thinking that perhaps the change had been effective. But the feeling of unease never left me. The constant awareness that someone might be watching me, the paranoia that had seeped into my routines, persisted. Every rustle of the trees, every distant figure that moved just out of my sight made me jump. My mind replayed the encounters, each day adding to the growing sense of dread. It was as if the man had imprinted himself on my psyche, his presence lingering even in his absence. Days turned into weeks, and though I rarely saw him again, the shadow of his presence remained. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning the periphery of my vision for any sign of him. It was exhausting, this constant state of alertness, and it began to affect other areas of my life. I found myself avoiding places where I might be alone, always on the lookout for the hooded figure that had come to symbolize my fear. One evening, I decided to take a walk around my new route, hoping the change of scenery might help me relax.
Hello.
As I rounded a corner, I saw a familiar figure in the distance. My heart sank as I recognized the hooded jacket.
Case, I think.
My pace quickened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't tell if it was the same man, but the sight was enough to send me into a spiral of anxiety. I went home and debated whether or not to report it again. Part of me felt it was pointless after all. The police had already told me they couldn't find anyone fitting the description. But the fear that had taken root in my mind was too strong to ignore. I decided to call them once more, hoping that this time they might take my concerns more seriously. Police came again, but the man was gone by the time they arrived. They reassured me that they would keep an eye out, but offered no concrete solutions. As I watched them drive away, I felt a deep sense of frustration and hopelessness. The hooded man had become more than just an unsettling figure. He had become a symbol of my own vulnerability, a reminder of how powerless I felt in the face of my fears. I continued my new jogging route, but the feeling of being followed remained an unwelcome companion. I tried to push through the anxiety, to reclaim my mornings and my sense of safety, but the shadow of that man lingered in the back of my mind. Despite the changes, the unease never completely faded. Each step I took was a reminder of the silent observer who had once haunted my runs and the lingering impact he had left on my life. Story 12. I woke up to an unsettling sight. My front door was slightly ajar. The morning light filtered through the gap, casting long shadows across the hallway. The sight of the door immediately jolted me awake, my heart racing with a sense of dread. I stumbled out of bed, my mind scrambling to piece together the disconcerting scene before me. The first thing I did was check the door itself. The lock was intact, and the bolt was engaged, but somehow the door had been left open just enough for someone to slip through. I scanned the hallway, looking for any signs of forced entry or anything out of place. That's when I noticed the muddy footprints leading from the door into my living room. I followed the trail, each step of the muddy prints seeming to get larger and more chaotic. They led me into the living room, where the footprints seemed to scatter as if the person had been pacing around. My breath quickened as I looked around, trying to make sense of the disturbance. Everything seemed normal, though furniture was undisturbed. Nothing was missing. I checked every room, peeking into closets and under beds, but there was no sign of an intruder. It was as if whoever had come in had vanished into thin air. I was about to call the police when my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. My heart sank when I saw that the voicemail was from my own number. I hesitated for a moment, trying to fathom how this could be possible. With trembling fingers, I tapped the play button. The message began with static, but then it was clear the recording was of me sleeping. I could hear the rhythmic sound of my breathing, the occasional rustle of the bedsheets, and even the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of my muffled snores. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been in my home recording me while I slept. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the full implications of the voicemail settled in. How had they managed to get my number? How had they made the recording? I tried calling my voicemail again, but the message had disappeared. Panic set in. I called the police and reported the break-in, trying to convey my growing sense of fear and confusion. They sent an officer to take a report and dusted for fingerprints, but they found nothing useful. No clues, no leads. The officer assured me that the best thing to do was to upgrade my home security and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. It was a helpful suggestion, but it did little to ease the turmoil inside me. That day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed amplified. I was on edge.
No one seems to believe me when I tell them the things that I've seen, except my uncle. Evening. In my room, my cousin will be here until Sunday. We spent a bunch of time reading the Dungeons & Dragons rulebooks. My cousin wanted to tell scary stories. I told him that we're unlucky. Well, if we're...
Good evening all and welcome. Tonight marks our first video 5 with 10 stories from the US. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Alabama. When I was in my early childhood, I had an adult neighbor who would watch me from his front yard. His name was Earl, and despite never playing golf, he often accidentally hit balls into our yard, watching me retrieve them. Earl gave off a strange vibe and made me feel weird.
There we go.
I'll never forget the day I went to pick out a pumpkin for Halloween. It was supposed to be a simple, regular trip. You know, the kind where you grab a pumpkin, carve it up, and let it sit on the porch with a flickering candle inside. But things didn't go as planned. It was late October, a few days before Halloween. The air was chilly, the kind of cold that sneaks through your clothes and clings to your skin. But the thing I remember most was the fog. Thick, heavy fog that blanketed everything. Driving through it felt like moving through a dream. The trees lining the road were just dark shapes looming in the mist, and the headlights of my truck barely cut through the haze. I had to squint just to stay on the road. I was heading to Old Thompson's pumpkin patch, a farm just outside of town. A buddy of mine had recommended it and said they had the best pumpkins. Old Man Thompson runs it, he'd said. Bit of an odd guy, but it's worth it for the pumpkins. I didn't care much about the old man. I just wanted a good pumpkin, something big enough to carve a decent jack-o'-lantern. The fog made the drive feel longer than it should have been, and by the time I pulled into the gravel lot in front of the farm, the sun was starting to set behind the fog, casting everything in a dull gray light. The place was eerily quiet. No other cars, no sounds except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I stepped out of my truck and looked around. The field stretched out in front of me, rows and rows of pumpkins, barely visible through the fog. I could only see a few feet in any direction. Beyond that, everything faded into the mist, like the world just ended at the edge of the farm. There was a small shack near the entrance, an old wooden structure that looked like it hadn't seen any repairs in years. A crooked sign hung from the roof, "Pumpkins for Sale," and sitting next to it, in a rickety chair, was the old man. He didn't move as I approached, just sat there, slouched, with his head low and his wide-brimmed hat hiding most of his face. His clothes were worn and tattered, his coat hanging loose on his thin frame. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his hands resting on his lap looked like gnarled branches. "Excuse me," I said, stopping a few feet away from him. My voice felt strange in the stillness, like it didn't quite belong there. "I'm here to get a pumpkin." He didn't respond at first, didn't even lift his head. I started to feel a little uneasy, standing there in the fog with this strange old man. I cleared my throat, trying again. "Do I just pick one from the field?" Slowly, the old man lifted his head. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He stared at me for a moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through me, but I told myself it was just the cold. "They're in the back," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The back?" I repeated, glancing at the field. The pumpkins were right there, scattered across the ground, but the fog made it hard to see far. He nodded, then slowly stood up from the chair, using a walking stick for support. He pointed past the field toward the far end, where I could just make out the shape of an old beat-up truck parked in the mist. The fog swirled around it, making it seem like it was floating on the edge of the world. I didn't want to follow him, but something about his stare made me feel like I didn't have much of a choice. I nodded and followed as he began to shuffle toward the truck. His footsteps were slow, dragging through the gravel as the fog thickened around us. The further we walked, the more distant everything felt. The road, the shack, everything seemed to disappear behind us, swallowed by the fog. When we reached the truck, the old man stopped and gestured toward the back. It was an old rusted thing, the kind you'd expect to see abandoned in a junkyard. The bed of the truck was filled with pumpkins, but they weren't like the ones in the field. These pumpkins were darker, almost black, their shapes warped and twisted like they had grown wrong. I frowned. I didn't like the look of them, but I figured it was just the fog playing tricks on my eyes. "Which one can I take?" I asked, glancing at the old man. He didn't answer. He had moved behind the truck, out of sight. I waited, expecting him to come back around and help me pick one out, but he didn't. The seconds ticked by, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. I called out, "Hey, sir," but there was no reply. I took a step closer, peering around the side of the truck. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. Nothing. I felt a strange twinge of panic rising in my chest. He couldn't have just disappeared. There was nowhere to go. The fog was too thick, and the field was wide open. I walked to the back of the truck, expecting to find him crouched down or something, but he wasn't there. He was gone. The spot where he had been standing was empty, just fog swirling in the air. I looked around, my heart racing now. There was no way he could have walked off without me hearing him. I should have been able to see him through the fog, at least a shadow or a shape moving away, but there was nothing. A heavy feeling settled in my chest. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. The air felt colder, the fog pressing in around me, thicker than before. I didn't want to be there anymore. I didn't want one of those pumpkins. I didn't even want to know what had just happened. I turned and hurried back toward my truck, my boots crunching on the gravel faster now. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. All I could think about was getting out of there, getting away from that fog, that field, and that strange vanishing old man. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. As I pulled onto the main road, the fog seemed to lift a little, but the uneasy feeling in my chest stayed with me. I never went back to that farm. Every time I pass it, even from a distance, I feel that same chill creep up my spine. I don't know what I saw that day, or where the old man went, but something wasn't right about that place. I want to tell you a story that still haunts me, even though it happened almost a year ago. It's the kind of thing you never expect to happen to you, especially when you're just trying to take a break from life for a while. My girlfriend Katie and I rented a cabin from Airbnb last October, thinking we'd enjoy a quiet, peaceful weekend in the woods. But what we found there was something we could have never prepared for. It was late afternoon when we arrived. The drive had been long, winding through forests that were just beginning to show the vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows of autumn. The cabin was exactly what we had hoped for, small, cozy, and isolated. It was tucked away off a gravel road, far from any nearby houses or towns. The air smelled of pine and damp leaves, the kind of scent that makes you feel like you're truly away from the chaos of everyday life. When we pulled up, everything seemed normal. The cabin looked clean and well kept, with a wraparound porch and a small pile of firewood stacked neatly by the door. We unloaded our bags, feeling excited about the weekend ahead. The inside was rustic, with a wood-burning stove, cozy couches, and a few old books left on a shelf by previous renters. It seemed perfect, too perfect maybe. After settling in, we decided to explore the cabin. Katie wanted to start by lighting a fire, so I began poking around, looking for matches and maybe a hatchet to chop some kindling. That's when I noticed a small door tucked away behind the kitchen. It was low, almost hidden, and I wouldn't have even seen it if I hadn't been looking for tools. "Hey, what do you think's down here?" I called Katie. She came over and looked at the door, a curious expression on her face. "Maybe storage? I don't know, it's kind of weird. But I guess cabins have cellars, right?" I shrugged and tried the knob, but it was locked. That struck me as odd. Why would a basement or cellar be locked in a rental? Still, I didn't think too much of it at the time. Katie and I decided to forget about it and enjoy the evening instead. We spent the rest of the day relaxing. We cooked a simple dinner and played cards by the fire, and by the time night fell, we were both feeling pretty good about our decision to come out here. The peacefulness of the woods, the crackling fire, it was the perfect escape. But things took a turn later that night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of knocking. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, like maybe a branch tapping against the window, or an animal rustling around in the woods. But as I lay there listening, I realized it was coming from inside the house. And more than that, it was coming from beneath us. The knocking was coming from the basement. Katie was still fast asleep, but I could feel my heart start to race. The knocking continued, slow and steady, like someone was trapped down there trying to get out. I shook Katie awake, and when she heard the noise too, she was just as freaked out as I was. "What do we do?" she whispered. I didn't have a good answer. The smart thing to do would have been to leave, to get in the car and drive as far away from the cabin as we could. But something stopped me. Curiosity maybe. I had to know what or who was making that noise. I grabbed the flashlight we brought with us and headed for the small door behind the kitchen. Katie followed close behind, her eyes wide with fear. When I reached the door, the knocking stopped, as if whoever or whatever was down there knew we were coming. I hesitated for a second before pulling out my multi-tool and working at the lock. It took a few tries, but eventually I heard the click of the latch giving way. Slowly I opened the door, revealing a narrow set of wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up from the basement was damp and musty, like it hadn't been opened in a long time. I shone the flashlight down the stairs, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There at the bottom of the stairs was a man. He looked gaunt and exhausted, with dirty clothes and wild eyes. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, staring up at me as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Please, help me," he rasped, his voice weak and cracked from what must have been days, weeks of dehydration. I was too stunned to speak. Katie gasped, gripping my arm tight. What are you doing down here?" I finally managed to ask. The man explained in broken sentences. He had rented the cabin a month ago, but he had gotten into some kind of dispute with the owner. He couldn't pay the full amount, and instead of dealing with it in a normal way, the owner had locked him in the basement. He had been stuck down there ever since, surviving on what little food and water had been left for him. I didn't know whether to believe him or not. The whole situation was so surreal, like something out of a horror movie. But looking at the man, at his desperate, hollow eyes, I knew he wasn't lying. No one could fake that kind of terror. We called the police immediately. When they arrived, they took the man to safety and arrested the cabin owner. I didn't get to see him, but the police told us later that he was a normal-looking guy, someone who didn't fit the profile of a monster. But looks can be deceiving, and that man had kept another human being locked away in his basement for weeks. We never got all the details. The police handled the investigation, and Katie and I left the cabin the next morning. We didn't want to stay another night, not after what we'd found. To this day, I still think about that man. How close we came to just ignoring the knocking. How we might have left, and no one would have ever known he was down there. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. Back when I was in middle school, I joined the school basketball team. I wasn't any good at basketball, but I signed up to keep busy after school. I wanted something to fill my time, even though I knew deep down that basketball wasn't for me. The other kids knew it too. They teased me all the time about how I could never make a basket, but I stuck with it, hoping things would get better, though they never did. One afternoon, after...
Yeah, audio cuts out when I go into reverse. Stopping to get me something to eat. Haven't eaten all damn day.
Myself. Sure enough, they started mocking me, saying I was the worst player on the team and that I couldn't make a basket to save my life. I tried to shrug it off.
I tried shrugging it off. Oh no. He tried.
Dragged me toward the lockers. I fought back, trying to wriggle free, but they were stronger. Before I knew it, they shoved me into my locker, slamming the door shut. I thought that would be it, that they'd leave it unlocked, and I could push it open once they got bored. But I was wrong. I heard the clink of the lock being put in place. They had locked me in. I panicked. I pounded on the door, shouting for them to let me out, but they just laughed and walked away, their footsteps echoing as they left the locker room. Silence followed. I was trapped, locked in a small dark space, with no way out. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was completely alone. Minutes passed, then an hour. I kept yelling, hoping someone would hear me, but no one came. I tried not to think about the fact that I had no phone. If I had brought it, I could have called for help. Instead, I was stuck in this tiny space, my only hope being that someone would eventually find me. The air in the locker felt heavy. I sat down, curling up in the cramped space, my knees pressed against my chest. Time seemed to slow down, and the silence around me became deafening. I was starting to lose hope when, finally, I heard something, the faint sound of a door creaking open. I perked up, banging on the locker door again, yelling for help. Footsteps approached, and then a voice called out, asking what I was doing in there. Relief washed over me. Someone had finally come. Through the tiny slits in the locker door, I saw a man in a janitor's uniform. He wasn't pleased. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head at the situation. I told him what had happened, that some guys had locked me in here after practice. He seemed annoyed but not surprised. The janitor said he didn't have the key to the lock, so he'd have to grab some tool to cut it off. He left for what felt like an eternity, though it was only a few minutes. The locker room felt colder now, as if the air had seeped out with him. But then he came back, holding a small angle grinder. After some loud scraping sounds, the lock finally came off, and the door swung open. I stumbled out, my legs stiff from sitting cramped up for so long. I thanked the janitor, my voice shaking. He didn't say much, just told me to be careful next time, and walked off, probably tired of dealing with students like me. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. I ran down the hall to the school lobby, my heart still racing. When I got there, I saw my mom pacing back and forth, worry written all over her face. She rushed over when she saw me, asking where I had been. I told her everything about the boys and the locker. She was angry and relieved at the same time, hugging me tightly as I told her the story. That night we talked for a long time. We decided that I would quit the basketball team. There was no point in staying, not when things had gone this far. I didn't want to be around those bullies anymore. It wasn't worth it. I didn't care about basketball that much, and I knew there were better things I could do with my time. The next day I found out the 3 boys who had locked me in had been suspended for 2 weeks. It felt strange knowing they were being punished. I had expected more, maybe even expulsion, but at least they were gone for a while. I didn't have to see their faces again, and that was enough for me. In the end, I found other after-school clubs to join. I made real friends, ones who didn't mock me or push me into lockers. I never played basketball again after that. It just wasn't worth it. Now, whenever I see a basketball game on TV, I think back to that day, to the sound of the lock clicking into place, and I'm reminded that sometimes walking away is the best decision you can make. My husband works nights at the local diner. He leaves before the sun sets, and I don't see him until the next morning when he's tired and quiet. It's a lonely routine, especially out here in the countryside, where the nearest neighbor is a long walk away. But we've been managing. It's peaceful most nights, just me, the trees, and the wind outside. Last night was different. It was around 2 a.m., and I was already in bed, trying to fall asleep. The sound of the old house creaking was normal, so I wasn't bothered by that. But then there was a knock. It came from downstairs, near the front door. It was soft at first, like someone tapping gently. My first thought was that maybe my husband came back early. It was rare, but sometimes he would get off early if the diner was slow. The knock wasn't urgent, just enough to catch my attention. I threw the blanket off, feeling the cool air hit my skin as I got out of bed. The house felt colder than usual. I hurried down the stairs, my feet moving quicker with the thought of seeing him home early. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a second. The knock had stopped, and everything was quiet. I opened the door, just enough to peek out, but there was nothing. No one. Just the front yard, bathed in pale moonlight, the trees in the distance swaying gently in the night breeze. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting, listening. I thought maybe he had gone around to the back door, but I didn't hear any footsteps. The stillness was unsettling. Finally, I closed the door, locking it. I turned off the light in the hall, making my way back to bed. Just as I was about to settle back under the covers, it happened again. Another knock, but this time it was louder, more deliberate. My heart started beating faster. I got up again, this time moving slower. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked toward the door. When I opened it, the child was standing on the porch. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. He was small, with messy hair and wide, confused eyes. He looked up at me like he was lost. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice soft but strange, almost like he wasn't fully awake. I was taken aback. Where did this kid come from? There weren't any children nearby.
Be right back. I'm going to get me
I
something to
glanced
eat.
around, expecting to see someone, maybe his parents. But there was no one, just him standing there alone. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't leave a child out there in the middle of the night. I knelt, trying to get more information. Before I could ask, something shifted in the shadows behind him. A man stepped out from the darkness. I didn't see him at first because he blended in so well with the night. He was tall, his face partially hidden, but I saw the glint of something in his hand, a knife. The realization hit me like a wave. He wasn't there to help the child. He was using him as bait. The man took a step forward, and I slammed the door shut. locking it as quickly as my hands would let me. I pressed my back against the door, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to catch my breath. I heard the man outside pacing, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Then the knocking started again. Not at the door this time, at the window. I turned my head toward the sound, the soft tap of metal against glass. He was trying to get in, testing the windows, moving from one to the next, each knock sending a spike of fear through me. I didn't know what he was capable of or how far he would go. My phone was upstairs, and every second I spent frozen in place felt like a lifetime. The sound of the knocking was relentless, moving around the house, first one window, then another. It felt like a game to him. I forced myself to move, sprinting up the stairs, my legs shaky as I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. My voice trembled as I told them what was happening. They said they'd send someone right away, but out here in the countryside, I knew it would take time. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. I stayed upstairs, listening, praying that the windows would hold. I didn't know if the man was alone or if more people were waiting outside. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pull up in front of the house. The knocking stopped. Everything went silent again. When I looked out the window, the man was gone. There was no sign of the child, no one lurking in the yard. The police searched the area, shining their flashlights into the trees, but they didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably just someone passing through, maybe trying to scare me. But I knew it was more than that. The way the man moved, the way he used the child, it felt planned, deliberate. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the sun to rise, my mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened if I had hesitated for just a second longer. Back in the mid-1970s, when I was about 12 years old, my friends and I spent almost every weekend at a playground in Flushing, Queens. It was a typical hangout spot for us, not because of the swings or slides, but for the basketball court and pickleball games. My group of friends, Sean, Jay, Jabbar, Apu, and Tino, were all a bit too old for the playground equipment, but we loved the space to run around. Most days were the same, routine and predictable, but one Saturday stands out more vividly than the rest. That day, Sean and I weren't in the mood for pickleball. The others were already deep into their game, but I had a different idea in mind. I was always the troublemaker, dragging Sean into things he normally wouldn't do. As we wandered away from the pickleball court, I looked toward the highway nearby. It was close enough that we could see the cars whizzing by, the blur of colors flashing in front of us like a challenge. I turned to Sean with a mischievous grin and asked, "You want to throw rocks at cars on the freeway?" His eyes lit up, matching my excitement. He didn't even hesitate, chuckling and agreeing. Without a second thought, we started searching for rocks, picking out smooth, round ones that fit perfectly in our hands. We lined up along the sidewalk, the cars speeding past just below us. It felt thrilling, like we were breaking some invisible rule just by standing there. The first few rocks sailed harmlessly into the air, missing the cars completely. We were almost ready to give up, laughing at how bad our aim was. But then with one final throw, a rock hit a black Subaru with a sharp The sound startled us, cutting through the noise of the highway like a knife. For a split second, everything froze. Then panic set in. We took off running, our feet pounding against the pavement as fast as we could go. Sean was quicker than me. He always had been. I was heavier, struggling to keep up, but fear kept me moving. My mind raced faster than my legs. What if the driver saw us? What if he followed? The thought of being caught was unbearable. We ran back toward the playground, where our friends were still playing pickleball, completely unaware of the trouble we had just stirred up. I was out of breath by the time we reached them, gasping for air as I stumbled onto the court. Sean was already there, looking a lot calmer than I felt. Trying to hide my fear, I shouted to our friends, telling them to switch places with us in the game. Without thinking, Jay and Apu stepped off the court, letting Sean and me take over. We had barely started playing when something made us stop. A man appeared, walking toward us with a purpose. In his hand, he carried a crowbar. My heart sank. This was the driver of the Subaru, no doubt about it. He wasn't shouting, but the look on his face said everything. His eyes swept over us, and I knew he was looking for the ones responsible. He asked where the kids who threw the rocks went, his voice filled with anger. My friends had no idea what he was talking about, and Jabbar asked him what he meant. I could feel Sean beside me, tense and quiet. I stayed calm, playing along with the act. When the man repeated that someone had hit his car with a rock, I pointed to my left, away from where we had come. They went that way, I said, keeping my voice steady. The man nodded, muttering something as he jogged off in the direction I pointed. As soon as he was out of sight, the weight of what we had done hit me. Jay turned to me and Sean, suspicion in his eyes. He asked what had happened, and I confessed, telling him we had thrown rocks just for fun, not thinking about the consequences. Jay shook his head, disappointed but not surprised. He knew me well enough to expect this kind of behavior. Whatever, he muttered, clearly unimpressed. Let's just keep playing. The others followed his lead, and we went back to our game, trying to forget the tension that had just filled the air. For the rest of the day, we didn't see the man again. But something had changed. The adrenaline that had fueled my reckless behavior was gone, replaced by a heavy feeling of guilt. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting him to return, even though I knew he wouldn't. Every time a car passed by the park, my stomach twisted, thinking it might be him coming back for revenge. But the hours dragged on, and eventually we all went home, the incident fading into the background like a bad dream. Now, decades later, I look back on that day with a mix of embarrassment and relief. Embarrassment for how reckless and stupid I had been, and relief that nothing worse had happened. That man with the crowbar could have easily caught us if things had gone differently. Who knows what he would have done? I often think about how lucky we were that day. I'm in my 50s now, with a wife and kids of my own. My children have never caused the kind of trouble I did back then. I've made sure of that. I taught them to respect other people and think before they act, something I wish I had understood when I was their age. It's strange how moments like that stick with you. A split-second decision to throw a rock at a car could have changed everything. It's a reminder, even all these years later, that one small action can spiral into something much bigger, something dangerous. And sometimes, you don't get as lucky as we did. A few years ago, when I was a sophomore at Hofstra University in Long Island, New York, I had just finished my degree in sports media, and my time at the school had been great overall. There were ups and downs like there are for everyone, but one night was far worse than anything I had ever expected. It was Halloween, my favorite time of the year. The day felt cool and crisp, with leaves swirling around campus. That night I had no plans. It was a Sunday, so most people were either at home or just hanging out. I thought maybe I'd find something to do, though. And as I left my dorm to get brunch, I noticed a poster pinned to the bulletin board in the hallway. It was for a frat party at Alpha Epsilon Pi, which I hadn't heard of before. This struck me as odd, since I was familiar with most of the fraternities on campus. The thought crossed my mind that something about it didn't seem quite right. Still, I figured I wasn't doing anything that night, so why not? It'd be a good way to pass the time. When nighttime came, I got dressed in a quick costume and made my way over to the frat house. The streets were dark and nearly empty as I walked, a slight wind rattling the trees. When I reached the house, it was quiet on the outside but looked lively from within. I opened the front door, letting the sounds of loud music and laughter wash over me. Inside, a guy introduced himself to me as Alex Suozzi. He was wearing a shirt with the fraternity's name on it, so I figured he was part of it. I'd heard rumors about him around campus, though. People said he was a creep, someone who should be avoided. I nodded at him and kept moving, hoping he wouldn't follow. He started talking to me, but I ignored most of what he said, pretending to be interested in other things. There was something off about him, though. He seemed to watch me closely, almost too closely. People had mentioned before that Alex was a cousin of Thomas Suozzi, the U.S. representative for New York's 3rd Congressional District. I didn't care much for that detail, but I guess it explained why he seemed so full of himself. Eventually, I found the drinks and poured myself one. I wasn't planning on staying too long, but after about 15 minutes, I felt strange. The room seemed to spin, and I felt way more drunk than I should have. I'd had drinks before, but nothing had hit me like this. It felt wrong. I knew I had to leave, so I stumbled out of the party, weaving through the house and finally making it back to my dorm room. Once there, I managed to kick off my shoes and crawl under the covers, the spinning in my head growing worse. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. That drink, it had been spiked. As I lay in bed, everything felt surreal, and I couldn't shake the thought that I had made a mistake by going to that party. I shouldn't have trusted a frat I'd never heard of. But at that moment, all I could do was close my eyes and try to sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but at some point, I woke up to the sound of drawers being opened and closed. My room was dark and my head felt heavy. At first, I thought I was dreaming, or maybe just confused from being so drunk. But the noise was real. I could hear my belongings being moved around. Slowly, I turned my head, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing by my bed. It was Alex. He was in my dorm room, standing right next to me, rummaging through my things. My mind struggled to process it. Why was he there? How did he get in? My door had been unlocked, of course. I had been too out of it to remember to lock it. He must have followed me back from the party. I could barely form a clear thought, still feeling the effects of whatever had been in that drink. But I knew I had to act. I forced myself out of bed, unsteady on my feet, and tried to push him out. My hands shoved at my strength. He just stood there staring at me and didn't care at all about being caught. Somehow I managed to force him toward the door. My body was sluggish, but I didn't stop pushing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I finally got him out of the room. I shut the door, locked it this time, and collapsed back into bed. The room was spinning again, and my limbs felt like lead, but at least he was gone. I had no idea what he had been planning to do, and I didn't want to think about it. The next morning, I woke up feeling terrible. Not just from whatever had been in that drink, but from the fear that had gripped me the night before. I emailed my professors, telling them I wasn't well enough to come to class. There was no way I could function properly after what had happened. I realized how stupid I had been to go to a party for a fraternity I had never heard of. The whole situation had felt strange from the start, and I should have trusted my gut. Even worse, I hadn't reported Alex or the frat to anyone. Part of me knew it wouldn't have made a difference. Fraternities had their power, especially with Alex being connected to someone in politics. Nothing would have changed. That night haunted me for a long time. After that, I never went to another college party. Now on Halloween, I just stay home and hand out candy to trick-or-treaters. It's safer that way. At least in my own space, I don't have to worry about someone following me back to my room. It was the mid-2000s, back when I was a junior in high school. I remember that year vividly because my school's hockey team won the state championship. I was part of the team, and we were thrilled with our victory. Our captain Dexter was on top of the world that night. Dexter was one of the wealthiest kids in our school, and his family had a massive house. So to celebrate, he threw a huge party right after the game. Pretty much the entire school showed up. It was the kind of party you'd imagine in a movie. Loud music, tons of people, and a never-ending supply of drinks. I don't even remember how many beers I drank that night. I know that as the night went on, I was getting more and more wasted. The party was a blur of laughter, music, and people shouting over each other. It started around 9 p.m., and by the time it ended, it was already 2 in the morning. Time slipped away so quickly. When the party finally died down, I decided to head home with 3 of my closest friends on the hockey team: Thomas, William, and Jack. We piled into William's car with him behind the wheel. Jack took the passenger seat while Thomas and I sat in the back. I was sitting right behind Jack, and Thomas was behind William. None of us should have been driving that night, but we didn't think much of it. We were young, drunk, and reckless. The car felt unsteady almost from the start. William was swerving left and right, and I could feel the car lurching around as if he wasn't really in control. We were only about 5 minutes into the drive when things started to get worse. I remember looking out of the window, trying to focus when suddenly the car seemed to lift off the ground. It felt like we were flying, but it wasn't some fun, weightless sensation. My heart dropped, and I realized what was happening. We were driving off a cliff. The panic hit me like a wave. All of us were screaming, but the sound was swallowed up by the car's tumble. The impact came hard and fast. The car smashed into the ground, and everything went dark for a split second. The first thing I noticed when I came to was the pain in my left leg. It was overwhelming, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I had broken my leg once before, but this was far worse. I could barely move. I heard Thomas groaning beside me, telling me he couldn't feel his legs. His voice was filled with fear, and I realized that he might be paralyzed. The worst part was the silence from the front seats. We called out to William and Jack, but they didn't respond. There was no sound, no movement. My gut twisted with the horrible realization that they were dead. Through the haze of pain, I fumbled for my phone. It was a miracle it still worked, even though the screen was cracked. With shaking hands, I dialed 911 and managed to tell them what had happened and where we were. They assured me help was on the way, but it felt like forever. When the paramedics finally arrived, they pulled us out of the wreckage. I don't remember much of the ride to the hospital. The pain in my leg was unbearable, and I drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point, I must have passed out completely. I woke up the next morning in a hospital bed. My whole family was there, crowded around me, their faces red from crying. They looked so relieved that I had survived, but something felt wrong. A nurse came in, and I could tell just by the look on her face that she wasn't bringing good news. She explained in a quiet, sad voice that they had to amputate my left leg. The damage was too severe, and it couldn't be saved. Eventually, I would get a prosthetic, but at that moment, I couldn't think about anything except the fact that my leg was gone. As if that wasn't enough, the nurse also told me that Thomas would never walk again. The paralysis was permanent. And then she said the words I had been dreading. William and Jack hadn't survived the crash. The news hit me like a punch to the chest. 2 of my best friends were gone, just like that. I felt like I couldn't breathe. On top of everything, my hockey career was over. No more skating, no more chasing dreams of going pro. It all ended in one night. In the months that followed, Thomas and I leaned on each other to get through the pain. We both knew we were lucky to be alive, even though the losses weighed heavily on us. We also realized we needed to make a change. The drinking had cost us too much already. So we quit cold turkey. Eventually, we started attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and before long, we were helping run them. Now we spend our time trying to convince others to stop before it's too late. It's not an easy road, but at least we're still here, still fighting. I still think about that night sometimes, about how different things could have been if we had made smarter choices. But the past is something I can't change. All I can do now is keep moving forward one step at a time, even if it's with a bionic leg.
Well, I guess he's the bionic man.
I know it's October, but I'm going to tell you about something that happened in the summer of 2018. It's been on my mind ever since, and honestly, I still miss the carefree feeling of summer, despite everything. This happened at a sleepaway camp in the Berkshire Mountains of Massachusetts. I had been going to this camp every summer since I was 9 years old, and by the time 2018 rolled around, it was my second to last year. I was about to start high school, and this camp felt like my second home. I knew almost everyone there because it was a mid-sized camp, not too big, not too small, and over the years I had made close friendships. But that summer, I met someone who left me with deep scars, the kind that never fully healed. His name was Ben. He was new to the camp, and I could tell right away because I'd never seen him before. We met on the first day, and I remember thinking he was incredibly attractive. He had this charm about him, and it seemed like he was into me too. We spent most of the day together, talking about our lives. At first, Ben seemed harmless. He came across as sweet, funny, and easy to trust. And at that age, I was still pretty naive, quick to believe in the goodness of others without hesitation. Within a couple of days, we became a couple. It felt so exciting, my first real relationship. We laughed together, and for those first few days, I felt happier than I ever had before. My friends teased me, saying I was abandoning them for a guy. They were joking, but part of me felt a little guilty for spending all my time with Ben. For the next 4 days, it was just Ben and me. We were inseparable, but on the 5th night, everything changed. It was around 9:30 p.m. after our usual evening activities. I went back to my cabin, took a shower, brushed my teeth, and slipped into my pajamas. By 10:30, the lights were out, and everyone else in the cabin had already fallen asleep. I've always had trouble sleeping though, so I just lay in bed, waiting for sleep to come. About 30 minutes passed, and I started to drift off. quiet of the night settling over the camp. That's when I heard the door to the cabin creak open. I wasn't alarmed at first. I figured it was just one of the counselors checking on us, or maybe one of the other campers coming back from the bathroom. But then I felt something strange, a slow tug on my blanket. The sensation was so light at first that I thought I was imagining it. But then it happened again, more deliberately. My blanket slid down my body, and I felt a hand touching me. A wave of fear washed over me as I realized what was happening. Someone was trying to pull my pants down. My body froze, and for a moment I couldn't move or scream. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought it might wake the others. But then instinct kicked in. I grabbed the flashlight I always kept by my bed and switched it on. The light cut through the darkness, and there, standing right in front of me, was Ben. The sight of him standing there, caught in the act, was like a punch to the gut. Without thinking, I screamed, the sound tearing through the cabin. Ben bolted for the door, disappearing into the night. My scream woke everyone else up. The lights came on, and my cabin mates stared at me, confused and groggy, not understanding what had just happened. One of the counselors rushed over to me, asking what was wrong. I was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out, but I told her everything, that Ben had snuck into our cabin and tried to undress me while I was half asleep. The counselor wrapped me in a hug, whispering that everything was going to be okay, but I could barely hear her over the adrenaline pumping in my ears. She said she was going to report it to the camp director right away and left to do just that. As soon as she was gone, the reality of what had almost happened hit me, and I felt sick to my stomach. I knew at that moment that I couldn't be around Ben anymore. I didn't care what the camp decided. I would stay as far away from him as possible. The next morning after breakfast, the camp director called me and my counselor to his office. I remember feeling anxious the whole way there, wondering what was going to happen. When we got to the office, the director was sitting behind his desk, looking serious. He told me that Ben had been placed on the do not return list, meaning he was permanently banned from the camp. He had been kicked out that very morning. I couldn't hold back the tears. It wasn't just relief. It was an overwhelming sense of gratitude that I was safe and that someone had believed me. I thanked the director, and after that, the rest of my time at camp passed without any more issues. But the memory of that night stayed with me. Now, as an adult, I still haven't fully healed from that experience. It left me with trust issues I carry to this day. I even began to identify as asexual afterward, as the thought of being with someone in that way filled me with dread. I haven't heard anything about Ben since then, and honestly, I don't care. What matters is that I'm moving forward, even if it's slow. If there's one thing I want others to take away from this, it's that trust is something that should be earned, not given freely. Be careful, get to know people first, and protect yourself. I learned that the hard way. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was on my last pizza delivery shift. The rain had started early in the evening, drumming against my car's windshield as I drove through the quiet streets. I was tired and just wanted to finish up so I could go home. But there was one last order to deliver. The address was a bit out of the way, a house on the edge of town, the kind of place that people didn't usually go to unless they had a reason. I didn't think much about it at first, just another job to get done. I followed the directions on my phone, driving further away from the familiar streets. The houses became fewer and farther apart, the trees thicker and darker as I moved away from the city lights. The rain picked up, making it hard to see. I turned on my high beams, cut through the sheets of water, and that's when I saw the house. It was old, really old. The kind of house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The paint was peeling off the walls, the windows were dark, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. But the house matched the address on my delivery app. This had to be the place. I pulled up slowly, parking the car right outside the gate. I grabbed the pizza from the passenger seat, hoping to get this over with quickly. I stepped out into the rain, pulling my hood up as I hurried toward the front door. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain was cold and heavy on my skin. I could feel the mud squish beneath my shoes as I walked up the cracked stone path. There was no doorbell, so I knocked. The sound echoed through the house, louder than it should have been. I stood there waiting, but no one came. I knocked again, harder this time, my fist echoing in the empty air. I was about to leave when the door creaked open. Just a little. No one stood there, though. "Hello," I called out, stepping closer to the door. It swung open wider as if inviting me inside. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of damp wood and dust. The hallway beyond was dark, barely lit by the glow of my car's headlights shining through the rain. I hesitated. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't just leave the pizza without delivering it. Maybe someone was inside, waiting. I stepped through the door, calling out again, "Pizza delivery." My voice echoed in the space. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The walls were cracked, and the floor creaked under my feet. Dust floated in the air with every step I took. I could hear the rain pounding on the roof, but everything inside was eerily still. No signs of life, no sounds of movement. I looked around, trying to find a table or counter to put pizza on, but there was nothing. Just a long hallway that led deeper into the house. The air felt colder, like the temperature had dropped the moment I crossed the threshold. My breath puffed out in front of me in little white clouds. I thought about turning back, leaving the pizza at the door, and getting out of there. But something made me stay. I can't explain it. It was like I was being pulled forward, deeper into the house. I started walking down the hallway, my footsteps sounding too loud in the silence. The floor creaked under my weight, the wood groaning as if it hadn't been walked on in years. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. It was slightly open, just like the floor had been. I reached out to push it wider, and as soon as I touched it, a cold breeze blew through the house, making the lights flicker. My hand froze on the door, and for a second I thought I heard something. A whisper, a faint voice. But when I strained to listen, there was only silence. I pushed the door open, and inside was a small room, empty except for an old chair in the corner. There was nothing else, no furniture, no people. Just that chair facing the corner, like someone had been sitting there staring at the wall for years. The air was thick with dust, and I felt like I was being watched. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But just as I turned to go, I heard it again. The whisper, but this time it was clearer. It was coming from behind me, from the chair. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it. A figure barely visible, sitting in the chair. Its outline was faint, like a shadow that didn't belong to anything. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure started to rise from the chair, slowly. The air around it grew colder, and I could feel the pressure building in my chest, like the house itself was pushing me out. That's when I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. I burst through the front door, slamming it behind me, and jumped into my car. The rain was coming down harder now, pounding against the roof as I sped away from the house. In 2016, I worked at a post office. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills. Most days were pretty routine, answering phones, sorting mail, and dealing with customers. Eventually, I found a better job, but my time at the post office left me with one experience I'll never forget. In my mind, it was a quiet afternoon, right after lunch. The office was peaceful, with only the hum of my desk, going through some paperwork. I picked it up as usual and greeted the caller with the company name and my own. On the other end,
Thank you,
a man's
Jack. We
voice
back
greeted
him.
me. "Hi there, would you sign my petition?" His voice was casual, almost friendly, but it was an odd request. Who calls a post office asking about a petition? I didn't even have time to process his question before his tone changed abruptly. "Sign my petition now," he demanded, his voice growing sharp. I was caught off guard by how quickly the conversation had taken a turn. Before I could even respond, he continued, "Just sign the petition." His voice was full of impatience and frustration. I finally managed to ask, "What petition are you talking about?" But he ignored my question and repeated the same demand, more forceful this time. I could feel my patience wearing thin. This was some kind of prank or a joke, and I wasn't in the mood for it. My frustration got the better of me, and I snapped. "Stop messing with me," I shouted into the phone. Looking back, I still don't know why I reacted so strongly, but at that moment, I couldn't help it. The line went quiet for a second, and And then the man's voice came back, colder and more menacing than before. Sign the petition or I'll follow you home and hurt your dog. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I don't even have a dog, but the threat felt personal and disturbing. My heart pounded in my chest. Who are you? I demanded, trying to keep
Yeah, what
my
dog
voice
is he gonna
steady.
punch?
He
Casper
chuckled
the
on
friendly
other
dog?
end. Billy Joe Bob, he said, his tone mocking, like it was some kind of joke. Where are you? Let's talk face to face, I challenged, hoping to get some kind of answer out of him. But he kept dodging the question, refusing to give any real information. Instead, he started to play the victim. Here I am just exercising my rights, and you people freak out over it. His words made no sense, and the way he twisted the conversation only fueled my frustration. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If you're going to make threats, you better be serious about it, I warned him, my anger bubbling to the surface. He muttered something about me being unreasonable, calling me names that didn't even fit the situation. I could only laugh at how ridiculous he sounded. And then, out of nowhere, he switched his tone again. Can't we all just get along, he asked, as if nothing had happened. I wasn't having it. If you want to meet, just say where, I told him, still trying to push him to reveal his location. I even gave him my address, but he kept avoiding the topic, refusing to answer. His frustration boiled over. You're the one being difficult, he shouted, before launching into another round of insults. I didn't flinch. At this point, I was too irritated to care about what he said. I decided to push back harder. I'm not afraid of you, I said firmly, but the conversation had already gone in circles too many times. Suddenly, he shifted the tone again, trying to sound clever or intimidating.
Oh, that's where I would
He thought
eventually
today was
fuck
just
with him.
another day, but guess what? Surprise! And then I heard it, a gunshot, loud and clear over the phone. My heart stopped for a moment. Was this guy serious? Was this happening? I sat there in stunned silence for a few seconds, unsure of how to react. But something inside me snapped, and I found myself laughing, almost in disbelief. I'm not going anywhere today, I said, shaking my head. And with that, I hung up the phone. The office was unusually quiet after I hung up. The usual background noise of computers and printers seemed distant, as if the world had paused for a brief moment. My heart was still racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this call was off. Just some twisted prank, or was there something darker lurking behind his words? I never found out. The man never called back, and as the days passed, I tried to put the incident behind me. But now and then, when I think back on that day, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I had stayed on the line a little longer, or if I had tried to find out more about it. The memory of that phone call still sends a chill down my spine, and I'll never forget the strange, unsettling feeling it left me with. Sometimes it's the things we don't fully understand that linger the longest.
Okay, that's the end of that one. On to the next one. Really?
This has been going on
There we go.
for 5 years. To start, I'm a female, 28 years old.
Don't sound familiar.
I was
Female.
unfortunately introduced to a man named Bill 5 years ago through a mutual friend. My friend felt bad that she wasn't into Bill romantically and felt like she had used up enough of his time only to have him land in the friend zone. So without my knowledge, she showed him a bunch of pictures of her single friends. And mine was the one that piqued his interest. I think the fact that I had never been in a relationship before made him even more intrigued. My friend gave him my number, and he began messaging me. I really had no interest in dating at the time, but I didn't want to be rude, so I would reply to him. Now, what my friend did to set this up was manipulative, so starting out, I think a part of me felt sorry for him. He would eventually spill his guts to me, telling me sob stories about how his father used to beat him, about how his grandmother was abusive, and how he had no friends. He told me he struggled with thoughts of self-harm. I would later find out that everything he told me was a lie. I had absolutely no intention of ever meeting him in real life, until my friend, Bea, the one who gave Bill my number, messaged me one day about hanging out with her. We lived about an hour away from each other, and I didn't have a car at the time, so my mother gave me a ride to a bookstore near the mall where we were going to meet. Bea met me outside, and after we gave our greetings and were heading inside, she dropped a bomb on me. I hope you don't hate me for this, and please don't freak out, but Bill and Philip are with me, and I thought we could turn this into a double date. Phil was another guy that she had been talking to and was genuinely interested in. As soon as she told me this, I should have turned around, walked out of that building, and have my mother turn around and come get me. But again, this stupid urge not to be rude prevented my common sense from prevailing. What they say is true. Hindsight is always 20/20. The date was truly uneventful, and I basically stonewalled Bill, hoping that he would just lose interest. But instead, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Fast forward a few weeks later, and Bill pops the question about being my boyfriend. Now, before anyone judges me, I realize that I made multiple terrible decisions. At this point in my life, I would say just about anything to avoid confrontation. And I'm now sharing my story as an example of what happens when you're too afraid to put your foot down. I told him yes. He told me some very concerning things about what he was going to do if he didn't find a girlfriend. So I played his game in the hopes that he would get bored and lose interest in me, and maybe find somebody else. This was the biggest mistake of my life. He became abusive toward me. He would take me to his grandmother's house, who lived 3 hours away from my hometown, and verbally and mentally badger me as a tactic to control me. And from there, things got physical, and even worse. In another twist, I found out that during this time, my friend Bea had been sleeping with Bill while he and I were together. Thankfully, this train wreck of a relationship only lasted about 6 months, until he found someone who he thought would be easier to control than I was. But apparently he was wrong, and would try to get back together with me. But my mother, who I was living with at the time, found out that he had stolen from me, and told him that he was never allowed back in her house. I'm still grateful to her that she did that, because that was really the only thing stopping him from coming back into my life. It's hard to explain, but I was going through some kind of Stockholm syndrome. Once he realized the relationship with the woman he had left me for wasn't going to happen, he stayed outside of my house in our driveway for 6 hours, as he continued to call and text me over 200 times. He also climbed up onto our garage in order to reach my bedroom window. It's a lot more difficult than it sounds, and when my father came home from work, he bailed. He continued to drive the 3 hours to my house almost every night, and only stopped when he didn't have the gas to make it. But he would always start again the next week. I had to change employment because he kept showing up at my job, asking for me. Even after I left that place, my former co-workers would let me know when he showed back up, looking for me. This went on for 6 months. Thankfully, my new job had security, and I informed them and my new boss about my ex-turned-stalker. Thank God he never found out where. To this very day, I am still blocking his new profiles on social media. We also need to replace our back door, because every few months, he comes back and tries to break in. I see him sometimes driving through my neighborhood. He wants to remind me that he's still here, watching me. The police in my area are utterly useless, and their response times are laughable. But the few times they have showed up, they just tell him to move on. I'm hoping he does something that gets him arrested and thrown in jail for a while. Until then, I have to keep my head on a swivel.
and hold on to the hope that one day I will feel safe again. I understand that my behavior has contributed to this situation, and I do take responsibility for that. I would just like everyone listening to learn from this, and also to pick better friends than I did. Bea is a tornado of psychopathy. She thought she was actually doing me a favor by hooking me up with this human turd, who she was sleeping with. Anyways, thanks for listening, and letting me get this off my chest.
Talk about obsessed.
A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just out of town. I was excited as it was my first job I had been offered since my graduation. It was just casual work, but I was still ecstatic at the chance to work there, as the money was great, and it was the place I did my training at. Most of the time, I would do 12-hour shifts from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sometimes I would work the late shift from 3 to 11. I never cared much for those. I was used to working late for my previous jobs, but I had to drive a lot further to get home. There was usually 4 nurses, 1 administrator, me, and the emergency doctor. That's it. Now, being in a small hospital like this one, you see some pretty strange things come in. Some people can't make it into the city, so we've had the emergency helicopter have to drop in every now and again. I've seen some pretty horrific things, like whole families dying from accidents on curved country roads. I've even had people bring in animals in desperation, as there was no veterinarian nearby that was open. This one particular night, around 10 p.m., I was sitting and talking with one of my nurses about a patient's chart, but I was mostly just wasting time until I got off at 11. The hospital was very quiet. I had only checked in 6 patients up to that point. I then heard a strange noise by the entrance. I then saw a man making his way toward us. He looked pretty normal, but he had on a long coat, which was strange as it was the middle of the summer, and even though it was dark, it was still very warm out. The nurse beside me let out a long sigh and got up to use the restroom, leaving me to deal with our new arrival. As he drew closer, the strange sound got louder, and something caught the light. He was dragging something behind him, but I couldn't make out what it was, although I assumed it was metal from the scraping sound it was making. It sent a shiver up my spine. He stopped at the desk, and I could see his eyes were wide, his pupils big. His face was pale, and it looked like he hadn't slept in a while. I had seen this look many times before, and immediately associated it with someone who was under the influence of something. He leaned on the desk and ran his fingers through his hair, pulling at it and grinding his teeth. When people like this come in, they are usually looking for drugs. Most of the time they will complain about migraines or fibromyalgia, anything we can't prove to the contrary. I processed him as usual and noticed he was becoming more and more irritable as time passed. Eventually, when I finished up, I pointed him toward the waiting area. He then asked how long it was going to be. Knowing that the on-call doctor had gone on a quick break, I estimated about half an hour. That's when his whole demeanor changed. The anger on his face was obvious as he stormed over to the waiting area, which is a room between the ER and the front desk. As he walked away, I caught a glimpse of what he was dragging behind him, and quickly came to the realization it was an axe. I panicked and almost called the code over the PA system, but I didn't want him to realize. I promptly called the police on my cell phone and ran down the hall to signal to the nurses we had an issue. The police would have to come from 2 towns over, which takes on average 20 minutes. Of course, as we were all pretty small girls, we didn't want to go near him. This man was tall and muscular. Even all of our forces combined, we wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me. I waited and waited, but I never got a response. I watched the man getting more agitated, and soon he began yelling and asking for help. I quickly hid from him. The other nurses and I devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass is reinforced, and the doors are heavy, so it should have been able to hold him there until the police arrived. The plan went down without a hitch, until the man realized what we had done. He started screaming and throwing chairs around the room. He then began using his axe on the door. We were all standing near the front desk and watching. I have never been so terrified in my life, and what made it even worse was the fact that he was making some headway on the door. It was around this time that the emergency doctor comes back from his break. He strolled through the front entrance, still sipping on a drink. When he saw all of us huddled by the front desk, he immediately took charge of the situation. After getting all the necessary, when he wasn't looking, he found the man's with cable ties and sat on his back until the police arrived. I was so grateful for having a young, physically fit doctor with us on that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think that'll ever be enough. As this was the second incident I experienced while working the 3 to 11, I decided to never work late shifts again. I'm now on a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 schedule, and I feel much safer now. Last August, I was hospitalized in the voluntary psychiatric ward at the local hospital due to some major anxiety and depression issues I was having. It was unfortunately my second hospitalization, and this time I would have to have a roommate. No one knows why, but for some reason when the psychiatric unit was built, they decided to put in double rooms. Because of this, they would often have high-functioning patients share rooms. Since I was here about a month ago, when I showed up, the nurses all remembered me. Stays in the psychiatric unit average about 1 to 2 weeks. Because it's the voluntary unit, there's no actively psychotic or violent people here, usually. My roommate, Jane, seemed nice enough. She was an unassuming, petite woman. One thing she really enjoyed doing was sitting at her desk and work on crossword puzzles. In fact, that was the only thing she ever seemed to be doing. In the rooms, each patient gets a desk and a dresser, which are right next to each other. I was admitted to the hospital around 6 p.m. By 9:30, I had taken my medication and was doing some meditation before going to sleep. I was looking at this beautiful picture of a tree and fence that was mounted to the wall and focusing on it while slowing my breathing. That's when I saw that there was writing on it. I hadn't noticed it earlier. It was in pencil and was put into the picture with enough force to indent it. The writing said, "They are all liars. Fucking liars." There were some other things I couldn't quite decipher. It creeped me out a bit, but I figure it had to have been the previous patient, so I went to the nurse's station to let them know. If you've ever been to a psychiatric ward, you'll know that most of the time, it's terribly boring. I spent most days walking around the unit. Some patients would actually count their laps. Apparently 30 laps equaled a mile. I also spent some time in the art room painting with a group. I began to notice that Jane never went to any of the groups. In fact, she never left the room. Then I realized that I had never seen her leaving the desk. Each time I came into our room, she would be sitting there, working on a crossword. I figured that's how she dealt with the boredom of this place. I tried to make small talk with her when I came in and out. I then realized something odd. The crossword puzzle she was working on never changed. It was the same exact one, with no progress being made. I would compare it to that scene from The Shining, where Mrs. Torrance discovers that all Jack had been writing for his screenplay was All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. It's quite a chilling way to discover that someone has gone off the deep end. The second night I came back in around 10:30 to go to sleep. She was still sitting at the desk, working on that same crossword puzzle with the lights on. I shrugged at it, because by this point she was no longer responding to me saying hello or asking if she was going to join the group. It was possible that she could have been having a reaction to some medication or just didn't feel like talking. So I turned off all my lights and pulled my privacy curtain closed. The medication I was on at the time basically knocked me out, so I was able to fall asleep pretty quickly. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to one of the medical assistants asking my roommate if she thought it was time to go to bed or turn off her light so that her roommate, referring to me, could sleep. She didn't really respond to the person and didn't turn off the light. I ended up just rolling back over and going to sleep. At some point she had turned off the light and gone to bed, because I woke up sometime later in complete darkness. I was confused. The medications I was taking would usually make me sleep for 12 hours straight. I then realized I could hear someone talking. It was Jane. She kept repeating, "Jesse, help me. Jesse, help me." I responded with, "Jane, are you okay?" She didn't reply to me, but she kept saying it over and over again, so I thought she may have been talking in her sleep. Eventually I dozed off again, only to wake up again at some point later. She was saying the same thing, only louder this time. I knew that she wasn't talking in her sleep this time. I tried to get her to respond to me, but she never acknowledged that I was even there. She just kept raising her voice. "Jesse, help me. I need help, Jesse." I got up and went to go get the night nurse, whose name was Jessie. I told her that my roommate was calling for her. By the time we got back into the room, Jane was hysterical. She was crying out for Jessie and trying to get out of bed. Jessie did her best to calm her down, and I was rattled. But I was given another sedation, and I ended up going back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, Jane wasn't in the room, and a table that had once been near her bed was now in front of the bathroom curtain. There were no doors because of self-harm risks. I went to use the bathroom, and there was an entire roll of toilet paper in the toilet bowl. Again, I went to go get a nurse, because I didn't want to be the one responsible for flooding the bathroom. I had already flooded a private bathroom by accident during my first stay. When I went out onto the floor, I realized two things. First, there was a medical assistant standing by the door near the front desk. Second, Jane was also standing at the door. The door only opens when someone phones in, so I was confused as to why there had to be someone essentially guarding the door. I found out from another patient who had insomnia that my roommate had spent the night running around the ward and throwing furniture around. They had finally gotten security down to talk to her, and she calmed down, but then stood in front of the door and was still standing there like a statue. 4 hours. I went about my usual routine of eating breakfast and painting. I asked some of the assistants about my roommate, and they tell me that she's been standing there since their shift started at 6 a.m. It's now 10:30 a.m. That made me a bit uneasy, but I just kept painting. I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I look up, and I see Jane outside of the room, staring in at me. She sees me look up and quickly looks away, but she doesn't move for a good 20 minutes. I get weirded out and decide to go back to my room for the first time that morning. She follows me into the room. I acted like I was just picking something up and leave again, and go to the assistant sitting at the front desk. I tell her politely that I might sound a bit paranoid, but that I think my roommate is following me around. So she lets me sit with her at the front desk. Because I'm sitting there with nothing to do, I decide to call my insurance company with a question. As I'm on the phone, Jane comes walking up with 2 plastic bins full of stuff. When they first let you into the unit, they give you a plastic bin full of various supplies. The bins were full of her stuff and my stuff. She also had the pillowcase off my bed that was full of my clothing. I lost it. Why does she have my stuff? That's my iPad. I kind of start freaking out. I do have anxiety issues myself. There were 3 nurses standing by, and they were flabbergasted. They had never seen anything like this. I'm now on the floor crying my eyes out, and someone kneels down and put their arm around me. It's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. I had my eyes closed and I assumed it was a nurse, but in a bizarre twist, it was actually Jane. I tell her to stop touching me, and then tell the nurses I want her away from me. The nurses ended up bringing me into a private meeting room to go through my stuff. They then tell me that Jane is going to be transferred to the involuntary ward at some point during the day. Unfortunately, due to Jane's behavior, I can't return to my room until the transfer is complete. While this was all going on, Jane has now moved to the back door, which opens up into a stairwell that goes down to the garden outside. There's no way for her to open it, obviously, and she just stands there for hours. After a while, I just start ignoring her, though she stares at me whenever I'm in her line of vision. It was around 6 or 7 p.m. My husband had come to visit me, and we were playing cards with another patient who had just moved into our unit. We were sitting in the cafeteria, which was right next to where Jane was waiting, separated by a wall of windows. I believe that she had stood there on purpose so that she could keep an eye on me. As we were playing rummy, we see the psychiatrist come up with 2 security guards. She starts explaining to Jane that she has to go upstairs now. Jane gets agitated and refuses to move. A security guard goes to take her arm, and then she goes berserk, turning to one of the windows and starts banging on it, looking straight at me and screaming for me to come and help. They literally drag her kicking and screaming upstairs. I was a bit shaken up, but at least it was gone now. I end up with another roommate, also named Jane, but this new Jane was super sweet, and she was in the unit because she was detoxing from a medication. My attending psychiatrist assured me that my reaction was completely normal, and so I started to feel a lot better. The next day after lunch, it was time to visit the garden. I actually really enjoyed going outside. It's refreshing after spending so many hours cooped up in the ward. At the time, we were only allowed 30 minutes. I became anxious when I saw that Jane, my former roommate, was one of the people in the garden from the upstairs unit. So I asked one of the supervisors if I can sit near them during garden time. They say that's fine, and everything goes okay. Jane doesn't approach me at all. Now you might think that I'm being a bit dramatic, but Jane is one of those people who only appears to not be paying attention. However, it only appears that way. When we came back inside, since I didn't need an escort back to my unit, I made sure to break off from the group and get away from Jane as soon as possible. But then, Jane makes a beeline, right for me, and she had to be restrained again. I didn't see her again after that. I think maybe the hospital staff don't like to think about what would have happened to me if she continued to be my roommate. This is a story that was told to me by my mother when I was old enough to understand what had almost happened to me. I was only a few weeks old at the time. In those days, when a mother had given birth and had taken their newborns home, midwives were sent from the hospital to check in on the baby and the mother once or twice a week. My dad was working, so he wasn't home, and my mother had put me to sleep and was going about her business in the house. 2 midwives had stopped by earlier that week, so she was confused when she heard a knock at the door. We lived in a very close-knit community where there was rarely any crime, but most people who lived there worked for most of the day, so it was basically deserted around this time. My mother was greeted by a male and a female who were both dressed in hospital uniforms with security badges. They politely asked if they could come in. They explained that they had been sent by the hospital. My mom let them in because they looked like professionals with the badges and uniforms. They even knew that she had a little girl and my mother's name. It was very convincing at the time, but that information was easy to access. The man said that he was going to take me upstairs to check on me, and the woman would look at my mom downstairs. However, my mother didn't feel okay about them wanting to separate us, and she explained that a pair of midwives had already been there that week and said she was going to call the hospital, as nobody had notified her that someone was coming just a day after. She also warned them that her husband, my father, was on his way home from work and wouldn't be happy about this unscheduled visit. At this point, the two got very defensive and said that they would leave after being really pushy with my mother to separate the two of us. After the back and forth, she finally got them to leave. They quickly changed their behavior to a more calm demeanor and said not to worry, and that it must have been a mistake. What was even stranger, though, was that when my mom opened the door for them to leave, there was another person waiting in a car outside who still had the engine running. She called the hospital, and they told her they didn't have any midwives scheduled to visit her that day, and that they would always alert the mother if they were going to send one. They also mentioned that they would never ask to separate the mother and the baby. My mother gave them a description of the visitors, and they told her they didn't have any male midwives at that hospital, and that she should contact the police right away. Terrified, my mother called my dad, who came straight home from work, and they reported the incident to the police, but it never amounted to anything that we know of. Who knows what those two were planning to do? If they had gained access to all that information about my mother, they must have had someone watching the house and knew that my father wouldn't be home. And they had even gone through the effort of obtaining the uniforms and badges. Thank God my mom acted on her instincts and got them the hell out of the house. It's even more creepy to imagine what my life would be like now if they had gotten to carry out what they were planning to do that day. I don't believe this could have been a genuine mix-up. They had not followed the standard protocol, and no one told my mother they were visiting. And they were very rude and defensive when my mother challenged them, which is not acceptable behavior from a health professional. I believe